day of the Russian Federation's armed attack in Ukraine, my office has been publishing daily updates on civilian casualties. We have consistently stressed that actual figures are likely considerably higher, as our figures only refer to those cases that we have been able to verify. In areas of intense hostilities, notably in Mariupol, it has been difficult for my staff to gain access and obtain and corroborate information. The pattern of causes of civilian casualties that my office has been recording in Ukraine has not significantly changed since the last time I briefed this body. The vast majority continue to be caused by the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas, such as shelling from heavy artillery, including multiple launch rocket systems and missile and airstrikes. According to our information, while such incidents can be attributed to both parties to the conflict, most of these casualties appear attributable to the Russian armed forces and affiliated armed groups. Excellencies, last week my monitoring mission in Ukraine visited 14 towns and villages in the Kiev and Chernihiv regions, which until the end of March were controlled by Russian armed forces. My team heard firsthand accounts of relatives, neighbors, and friends being killed, injured, detained, and disappeared. This was the second OECHR visit to these regions, and it pains me to imagine how many visits will be needed to document only a fraction of the egregious human rights violations that have occurred there. To date, over 1,000 civilian bodies have been recovered in the Kiev region alone. Some of these people were killed in hostilities, others appear to have been summarily executed. Others still have died because of stress to their health caused by hostilities and the lack of medical aid. They have spent weeks in basements being threatened by Russian soldiers with abuse or death if they tried to leave, thereby placing these individuals at severe risk from the hostilities. In the village of Yahitne, in Chernihiv region, 360 residents, including 74 children, and 5 persons with disabilities were forced by Russian armed forces to stay for 28 days in the basement of a school that they were using as their base. The basement was extremely overcrowded. People had to sit for days without an opportunity to lie down. There were no toilet facilities, water, or ventilation. 10 older people died. The scale of unlawful killings, including indicia of summary executions in areas to the north of Kiev, is shocking. While we have information about 300 such killings, the figures will continue to increase as new evidence becomes available. These killings of civilians often appear to be intentional, carried out by snipers and soldiers. Civilians were killed when crossing the road or leaving their shelters to seek food and water. Others were killed as they fled in their vehicles. Unarmed local men were killed because Russian soldiers suspected them of supporting Ukrainian forces or otherwise being a potential threat. And some were tortured before being killed. In the village of Katyushanka, Kiev region, a young couple, their 14-year-old daughter and a grandfather, were shot by Russian soldiers while trying to drive to their house. The parents were killed while the child received 2 gunshot wounds. Today we have recorded destruction or damage to hundreds of educational and medical facilities and tens of thousands of civilian houses as a result of the hostilities. Throughout the country, at least 50 Christian, Jewish, and Muslim places of worship of different denominations have been damaged. More than half of these have been severely damaged and cannot be used. Excellencies, the city of Mariupol and its residents have suffered unimaginable horror since the Russian Federation's armed attack started. I'm shocked at the scale of the destruction and the numerous violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law that have reportedly been committed in the city, including attacks against civilians and civilian objects. A once flourishing city lies in ruins. We estimate the civilian death toll in Mariupol to lie in the thousands, while only with time will the true scale of atrocity and casualties and damage become clear. Active hostilities are now focused on the Ashtoval industrial area, with residential areas of the city now largely occupied by the Russian armed forces and affiliated armed groups. This raises human rights concerns of a different nature than those arising in areas of active hostility. I am relieved that over 500 civilians, including children and older persons, have now been successfully evacuated from the Azovstal steel plant and other areas following the joint efforts of the ICRC and the UN. Combatants that are over the combat by sickness or injury, must also be allowed to be evacuated to receive the medical care required by their conditions. Excellencies, my office is looking into allegations of sexual violence and has verified a dozen cases across the country. I am concerned by allegations of sexual violence that have emerged from areas in the Kiev region that were formerly under the control of Russian armed forces. There were instances of rape and murder of victims or their relatives. Survivors are often unwilling to be interviewed because of fear and stigma. Women and girls are the most frequently cited victims. However, reports of men and boys being affected are starting to emerge. The mission also spoke to people who are searching for their relatives and friends. It has documented some cases of Russian armed forces having detained civilians, mostly young men, and then transferred them to Belarus and then Russia, where they have been held in pre-trial detention centers. Overall, since 24th of February, we have documented 204 cases of enforced disappearance. Of them, 169 men, 34 women, 1 boy. The overwhelming majority of them by Russian armed forces and affiliated armed groups. Among them are public officials, journalists, civil society activists, retired servicemen of the armed forces, as well as other civilians. According to information available to us, 38 of them had been released and returned home, and 5, 4 men and 1 woman, were found dead. The real number of enforced disappearances is again likely higher. We have also documented 10 cases of possible enforced disappearances of people considered to be pro-Russian in government-controlled territory, which appear to have been committed by Ukrainian law enforcement officials. 7 of those victims have since been reportedly released. My office is also following cases of conflict-related detainees in government-controlled areas which raise fair trial concerns. Excellencies, the only way to bring a stop to further violations is to end the hostilities. That must remain the primary objective. However, while hostilities continue and for as long as they last, all parties must give clear instruction to their combatants to protect civilians and persons over the combat, as well as to distinguish between civilian and military objects. Those in command of armed forces must make it clear to their members that anyone found to have been involved in such violation will be prosecuted and held accountable. I urge both parties to the conflict to fully respect their obligations under international human rights law and international humanitarian law, including to investigate all allegations of violations, and above all, to commit to protecting every civilian woman, man and child, and those over the combat. Our common humanity demands no less. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, señora alta comisionada. Tiene la palabra ahora el señor Víctor Madrigal Borlós, presidente del Comité de Coordinación de los Procedimientos Especiales del Consejo. Tiene la
Buen
palabra,
día, señor presidente. ¿Me escucha bien?
Sí, perfecto, Víctor. Adelante, por favor.
Muchas gracias. Mr. President, distinguished delegates, I have the honor to address the Council today on behalf of the Coordination Committee of Special Procedures. Since 24 February, my colleagues and I have been receiving information, each within the confines of our mandate, about the disastrous consequences of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Every day, this information adds to a catalog of grave violations of international human rights law and humanitarian law. Today is the 78th days of hostilities, 78 days of utterly unjustified human suffering, days during which we have been forced to reiterate our outrage. Beyond our condemnation, these 78 days also require concrete action to end hostilities and adopt peaceful solutions. Special procedures mandate holders have done their utmost to raise the attention of the community of states to the crisis plaguing Ukraine and to make concrete public statements addressing the wide range of serious human rights concerns. Often, we have done so in cooperation with other UN and regional bodies, such as treaty bodies or other UN envoys or representatives. These concerted actions across the UN system demonstrate the urgency and seriousness of the situation, as well as our shared determination to contribute to a peaceful solution. Excellencies, let me remind you of the key messages issued by special procedures since 24 February. My colleagues and I remain collectively appalled by the aggression by the Russian Federation on the sovereign state of Ukraine, harming its territorial integrity, and we reiterate that the use of force by one state against another is fundamentally unacceptable and strikes at the very heart of the object and purposes of the Charter of the United Nations. The consequences of this military attack on the protection and promotion of human rights in Ukraine will be profound and long-lasting, and will cause immense suffering and irreparable harm lasting for generations. We are appalled by the disturbing reports of violations of international human rights and humanitarian law, which in some cases may amount to war crimes. As recently as last week, several of my colleagues expressed concerns at thousands of civilians killed and injured, and countless others living through daily bombardment and violence. We just heard from the High Commissioner the concerning indicia of hundreds of extrajudicial killings. Homes, schools, hospitals, care institutions, and entire cities have been destroyed. Mines and explosive remnants of war continue to pose alarming threats to civilians, including those remaining in their homes and those fleeing the conflict. My colleagues also have expressed serious concerns at the dire humanitarian situation, referring to internally displaced persons, the absolute majority of whom are women and children who have lost everything. Many of them face shortages of food, water, basic items and energy, and lack access to health services and medication. Mandate holders also brought your attention to the appalling humanitarian situation of older persons and persons living with disabilities. They have stressed that they are often amongst the last to flee conflict zones and face many challenges during displacement, living in poorly equipped temporary shelters and struggling with chronic health conditions without access to proper health care and rehabilitation centers. My colleagues and I remain profoundly concerned about the safety and protection of everyone in Ukraine and the well-founded fear which now pervades the daily life of every member of that society. I've mentioned by some colleagues last week, alongside internally displaced persons in Ukraine, the estimated 13 million people who are stranded in areas affected by the conflict are experiencing acute risks as well. Their lives and security are threatened, and they are largely unable to access life-saving assistance due to ongoing attacks and insecurity. We condemn all attacks targeting civilians and call for them to stop immediately. The secondary effects of the conflict and displacement on food production, which are forecast to affect the availability of food in Ukraine and globally, is also a serious concern. Colleagues warned that with the Russian aggression, we are now facing the risk of imminent famine and starvation in more places around the world. Where the private sector may be concerned, be it relating to supply chains, production, or even technology, my colleagues have reminded businesses to ensure they are implementing human rights due diligence to prevent and mitigate the negative impacts of their decisions and to ensure that they're not causing or contributing to grave human rights abuses in situation of armed conflict. Several mandate holders have warned about the heightened risks of all forms of sexual violence due to the conflict and displacement, something that is very much consistent with what you just heard from the High Commissioner herself. Multiple forms of gender-based violence are being reported, such as sexual exploitation and abuse and sexual violence, including conflict-related sexual violence. Women and girls on the move experience particularly high insecurity and risk of violence, including trafficking in persons. My colleagues have also stressed that unaccompanied and separated children are particularly vulnerable to the risk of trafficking, violence, abuse, and exploitation. The lives of all people in Ukraine are in danger, including ethnic, national, linguistic, and religious minorities. As stressed by some colleagues, the conflict is indeed affecting regions where different ethnic groups have been coexisting with each other for many years. The war in Ukraine is life-threatening not only to its multi-ethnic nation, but also to unique minority cultural heritage sites all over the country. Colleagues have also noted with serious concern reports of people of African descent and racial and ethnic minorities being subjected to discriminatory treatment as they flee Ukraine. We recall that all parties should allow safe and unfettered passage to destinations outside Ukraine for all those fleeing the conflict and facilitate the rapid, safe, and unhindered access to humanitarian assistance for all those in need in Ukraine without discrimination of any kind. Mandate holders are also profoundly concerned about the safety of journalists, media workers, and associated personnel in Ukraine who are carrying out their work under unprecedented conditions and are now at a very high risk. My colleagues have referred to numerous reports that journalists are being targeted, tortured, kidnapped, attacked, and killed, or refused safe passage from the cities and regions under siege. They also underline that propaganda for war and national hatred, which constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence, are profoundly harmful and prohibited under Article 20 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and called on the Russian Federation to immediately refrain from these unlawful practices. They also have noted that the war has further highlighted the risks of proliferation of disinformation, misinformation, and incitement to violence and hatred, and restrictions of lawful speech on digital and social media platforms as a result of their business models, policies, and practices. We call on the Russian Federation to immediately end its invasion of Ukraine to avoid further bloodshed and loss of life. We strongly condemn and remind that international attacks against civilians and civilian objects amount to war crimes. We urge the parties to the conflict to respect international humanitarian law and international human rights law. All alleged violations must be thoroughly, independently, impartially, and effectively investigated, with a view to establishing full accountability of all those responsible. Full light must be shed a humanitarian ceasefire and call for meaningful negotiations for peace. My colleagues and I maintain ourselves ready to continue assisting this Council and the parties concerned. We're also ready to cooperate with all relevant mechanisms to ensure coordinated action towards restoring full peace and full respect for human rights in Ukraine, And in that context, we welcome the establishment of the Commission of Inquiry established by this Council and call on all to cooperate with it, something that we are, of course, ready to do ourselves. In that vein, we also invite the Commission to avail itself of the analysis and conclusions of special procedure mandate holders in the preparation of its own work, analysis, and conclusions. I thank you very much, Mr. President.
Muchas gracias. Le agradezco su declaración. Ahora doy la bienvenida a los tres miembros de la Comisión Internacional Independiente de Investigación sobre Ucrania, establecida por este Consejo. Contamos con la presencia aquí de Yasmín Kantsumur, Pablo de Graaf y el presidente de la Comisión, Eric Mose. Y tiene la palabra ahora el señor presidente Eric Mose.
Distinguished President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry, I would like to thank the President of the Human Rights Council for inviting us to this special session. I have the pleasure, as just mentioned, to be accompanied by the two other members of the Commission, Mrs. Yasmín Kantsumur and Mr. Pablo de Graaf. Let me first give a brief overview of our work so far. The Commission members have had numerous remote meetings, including discussions of relevance to the implementation of our mandate. On 27th April this year, the Commission participated at the Security Council Area Formula meeting about accountability for atrocities. As mentioned there, our purpose was to demonstrate in a visible way the Commission's availability to communicate with all stakeholders from the beginning. This week, the Commission convened in Geneva and held meetings with a large number of member states, NGOs based in Ukraine, and Geneva-based NGOs. We have also solicited the views of the Permanent Mission of Ukraine and the Prosecutor of Ukraine. The Commission has sought contact with the Russian Federation, and it remains ready to communicate with them. We have exchanged views with the High Commissioner's monitoring mission in Ukraine and with the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights on coordination and cooperation within the framework given to us by the mandate in Resolution 49.1. Given the presence of the mission in Ukraine since 2014, resulting in over 40 reports, we consider the contact with the mission of utmost importance. Considering the large number of entities that are investigating the situation in Ukraine, coordination issues were raised with several of the interlocutors that we met. The Commission, as stated in its mandate, is independent. It has no link to any particular country, party, or entity. The Commission will continue to seek contact with the parties to the conflict, with victims, civil societies, and other stakeholders. It will be necessary to build upon a broad range of sources that will have to be considered together. The Commission will consider the evidence carefully, giving particular weight to primary evidence and seeking corroboration whenever needed. The findings of the Commission reporting to the Human Rights Council will be based on the independent assessment of the commissioners and their analysis of the information and evidence that comes out of their investigations. While not a strictly judicial instance, one of the Commission's tasks is to identify, where possible, individuals and entities responsible for violations or abuses of human rights or of international humanitarian law or other related crimes. The Commission intends to take a victim-centered approach to make recommendations about the full range of accountability measures. We understand that the budgetary process assigning the resources to the Commission is ongoing. It is important that the Commission is provided with sufficient resources to be able to conduct its activity in full, with the necessary staff and the ability to visit Ukraine and other areas where information and evidence is available. We have noted the draft resolution to be considered here today. The Commission will continue implementing its mandate in accordance with the original Resolution 49-1, taking into account the seriousness of the allegations that have been reported in relation to the events under consideration by the Human Rights Council at this specific session. We would like to use this opportunity, finally, to thank the Human Rights Council and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights for the support provided in this important process so far. Thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco su declaración y la presencia de los miembros de la Comisión. Ahora escucharemos a los países implicados. Tengo entendido que la Federación Rusa no está en la sala. Por lo tanto, tiene la palabra entonces la distinguida representante de Ucrania. Tiene la palabra, embajadora.
Mr. President, Excellencies, dear colleagues, it has been 10 weeks since this Council discussed the human rights and humanitarian situation in my country stemming from the Russian aggression at its 49th session. These have been 10 weeks of sheer horror to the people of my country, 10 weeks of time of deep suffering for every Ukrainian family without exception. International destruction to everything that we have been trying to build up since 3 decades of our independence reconstruction. Thousands of people in my country have lost their lives, more than 200 children among them. Russian bombing and shelling have become a part of our everyday life, and even now, while I'm talking to you sitting in my office in Kiev, together with thousands of hundreds of other diplomats, we are unsafe under such conditions and circumstances. Millions have left their homes, having become either refugees or eternally displaced persons. Dozens of cities have been leveled to the ground. Others have become unsuitable to live in. Over 500,000 of our citizens forcibly deported to the Russian territory with their whereabouts unknown. Torture and enforced disappearances, sexual and gender-based violence, the list of Russia's crimes is endless. In addition to that, we are receiving an alarming information from the human rights defenders about the use of Crimean jails for the Ukrainians illegally detained and forcibly relocated from newly occupied areas of my country For example, from Kherson, and by the way, the Russians have already launched the new project. They have been cooking the new so-called Kherson People Republic by blackmailing people, by killing them only for the refusal to collaborate with the so-called newly appointed administrations, or Melitopol or Mariupol or other cities. This council and its member states have a duty and, I believe, moral responsibility, respectively, to act. In March, the Council has adopted a resolution which has passed with strong majority, and I wish to thank its members and those who supported the resolution for this stand with my country, for your support, because this is exactly what we call fuel. This is exactly what we need to keep on fighting and to resist. Back then in March, we all took an important step aimed at ensuring future accountability of criminals for committing atrocities by establishing the Commission of Inquiry. Now the time has come to take further steps in this direction. The areas of Kyiv, Chernihiv, Sumy, Kharkiv regions, which have been under Russian occupation in late February and March, have experienced the most gruesome human rights violations on the European continent in decades. This has already been mentioned by Madame Bachelet, whom I met physically half a year ago before the invasion started, while we were discussing the Crimean occupation and the consequences of this occupation. And we never thought that we would find ourselves discussing these atrocities within the full-fledged invasion of Russia. Thousands of innocent civilians executed in the presence of their family members, women raped in front of their children, children raped in front of their mothers, like the 11-year-old boy who was raped in front of his mother. He actually lost the ability to speak after, and the only way how he communicates with the world are the black lines. And this is the first picture that he drew working with a group of psychologists who are trying to help him to recover. It is time for this council to say its word and to mandate a special investigation of the Commission of Inquiry into these crimes. And I therefore urge all member states to support the draft resolution, the deteriorating human rights situation in Ukraine stemming from Russian aggression, which will be presented at this session. At this background, the situation in Crimea is, of course, overshadowed by the new wave of military aggression by the Russian Federation in Ukraine. Ukrainians in Crimea are conscripted into the Russian army and forced to fight against their motherland. Refusal to be conscripted means jail and prison. They are deprived of their right to own land in Crimea, to study in their language, their native language. Their religious institutions are closed or arrested by the occupation authorities. The Crimean Tatar leaders and Ukrainian activists have been arrested or imprisoned for nothing and hold in prison up to 2 decades. They have been allegedly called spies, saboteurs, and terrorists. Mr. President, it is difficult to imagine anything worse what has happened in now liberated areas, but the situation in Mariupol, I believe, is even more disturbing. The world has been shaken by reports of bombing of maternity hospital and drama theater. Events like this should have leave no doubt that Mariupol must be on the top of this council's agenda. The city of 500,000 residents has been turned into dust, but refused to surrender. For 78 days and until today, Ukrainian defenders at the last outpost of Azovstal steel plant are resisting against the Russian invasion and invaders. Dear friends, food security in Ukraine appears to be another deliberate target of Russia. The looting about 400,000 tons of grain from the temporarily occupied areas of Ukraine, the blockade of shipment from Ukrainian ports, and the mining of shipping routes endanger global food security. Russia, in fact, harms not only Ukraine, but the world population through its illegal actions. According to the United Nations, over 1.7 billion people may risk poverty and famine as the result of this Russia's full-fledged war against my country. Moscow's unprovoked war is a war against us all, and only with the world standing strong in solidarity with the Ukrainian people can defeat this pure evil. I thank you for your attention.
Agradezco a la primera viceministra de Relaciones Exteriores, Emine Zaparova, por su intervención y su participación. Y antes de pasar a la lista de oradores, quiero agradecer la presencia de los miembros de la Comisión Internacional Independiente de Investigación sobre Ucrania que nos acompañaron y que están finalizando su misión en Ginebra y deben comenzar a partir, así que quedan liberados en caso de que ya deban partir y les agradecemos mucho su presencia. Ahora sí, vamos a pasar a la lista de oradores. Permítanme recordar los límites de tiempo establecidos de 2 minutos y 30 segundos para los miembros del Consejo y 1 minuto y 30 segundos para los observadores. La lista de oradores se cerrará en 15 minutos. Vamos a comenzar con la lista de oradores de los Estados miembros del Consejo. Y le doy la palabra en primer lugar a Su Excelencia Mr. Carsten Nemra, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade of the Marshall Islands, by video on behalf of a group of countries.
Thank you, Mr. President. I am pleased to deliver this statement on behalf of the group of Friends of Accountability following the aggressions against Ukraine. 77 days have passed since Russia's unprovoked, unjust, and illegal invasion of Ukraine. For 77 days, Russian armed forces have indiscriminately shelled and bombed populated areas of Ukraine, targeted civilians, destroyed and damaged hospitals, school, and other civilian infrastructure, as reported by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Bucha, Kramatorsk, and Mariupol are but some of the names now associated around the world with suffering and devastation because of the Russian aggression. We deplore the thousands of civilian casualties, including hundreds of children. We are appalled by the continued reports of the use of torture and other ill treatment, arbitrary killings and detention, and forced disappearances and sexual and gender-based violence. These are actions that may amount to war crimes and other crimes under international law. Such atrocities, crimes are crimes against all of us. The Russian state-sponsored massive disinformation campaign is an affront to democratic processes and human rights and requires all states to be vigilant in exposing the truth. We are gravely concerned about the devastating spillover effects of Russia's invasion on global food and energy systems. Least developed, lower-income and middle-income countries, as well as on persons in vulnerable situations in all the region around the world, will be most severely impacted. Excellencies, we stress the importance of preserving the long record of non-use of nuclear weapons. We call on the Russian Federation to exercise restraint and de-escalate its nuclear rhetoric. It is imperative that all perpetrators of violations and abuses of human rights and violation of international humanitarian law be held to account. Justice for victims is a foundation for future peace and reconciliation and for the prevention of further atrocities. For this, the collection and preservation of evidence is essential. The Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine has a central role to play in this regard. We welcome the shift appointment of its 3 members and thank them for their update provided to the Council today. We encourage continued efforts to ensure the prompt and full operationalization of the Commission of Inquiry to investigate all alleged abuses and violations of human rights and violation of international humanitarian law and related crimes in the context of Russian Federation's aggression against Ukraine. The group of friends also welcomes the investigation launched by the International Criminal Court and the recent report by the experts appointed under the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe's Moscow mechanism as critical steps towards accountability. Importantly, these efforts are complemented by national investigation in Ukraine and other countries, including on the basis of universal jurisdiction and by the work carried out by the OHCHR, especially the Human Rights Monitoring Mission Ukraine and civil society actors. Coordination of efforts among the different actors is of crucial importance. Therefore, we call on all those involved in the collection and preservation of evidence to coordinate proactively to ensure complementarity and the meticulous collection of the most precise evidence available. Finally, we reiterate the importance of comprehensive, verifiable, and transparent records of casualties in situations of armed violence and conflict, which can contribute to better protection of civilians and help prevent violations of international law. The process towards accountability will bring challenges, but we will not let others be discouraged. The group of friends is committed to information sharing, awareness building, and advocacy. Impunity must be fought, justice must prevail, and international law and human rights must be protected. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Tiene la palabra Estonia en nombre de un grupo de países. Su Excelencia, la señora Eva María Limets, ministra de Relaciones Exteriores, por video.
Mr. President, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the Nordic Baltic countries. We welcome the convening of this special session and thank the High Commissioner and the speakers for their statements. It has been more than 2 months now since Russia launched the unprovoked and unjustified war against Ukraine in grave violation of international law. Russia has consistently ignored the calls by the UN General Assembly, this Council, other international bodies, as well as the order of the International Court of Justice to cease aggression and immediately withdraw all forces and military equipment from the territory of Ukraine. The General Assembly has voted in favor of suspending Russia's membership rights of this very Council, a clear sign that the world has strongly condemned Russia's actions, including the grave violations of human rights. Unfortunately, all this has not been enough. We are still facing one of the fastest growing displacement and humanitarian crises where innocent civilians suffer the most. We are seeing devastating consequences globally, including for food and energy security. Developing countries and persons in vulnerable situations are the most affected. As said by the High Commissioner, Russian armed forces have indiscriminately shelled and bombed populated areas, wrecking hospitals, schools, and other civilian infrastructure. We are witnessing torture and other ill treatment, sexual and gender-based violence used as a weapon of war, arbitrary arrests, abductions, enforced disappearances and deportations, especially of children and their illegal adoptions in Russia. We are witnessing what may amount to the war crimes and crimes against humanity on a daily basis. We strongly denounce Russia's actions as well as the denials, deceptions, lies and disinformation. We also support the need for national and international, transparent, independent and prompt investigations into all violations and abuses of international human rights law and international humanitarian law. We welcome the work already done by the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine. We fully support the investigation by the International Criminal Court and other initiatives. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Je donne la parole à la France au nom de l'Union européenne.
Monsieur le Président, l'Union européenne remercie la haute-commissaire et l'ensemble des intervenants pour leur rapport. L'ampleur des violations des droits de l'homme commises par les forces russes en Ukraine, les images des souffrances indicibles causées par la Russie à Boutcha, à Borodianka, à Bilorivka, à Kramatorsk ou à Mariupol, gravées dans nos mémoires, justifient pleinement la convocation de cette nouvelle session. Les assassinats de civils, les cas documentés de viols, d'exécutions sommaires, de disparitions forcées, les traumatismes infligés aux enfants, le ciblage à grande échelle d'infrastructures civiles, les sièges interminables de villes encore peuplées et le chantage humanitaire, les 12 millions d'Ukrainiens chassés de chez eux montrent le vrai visage de la guerre menée par la Russie. Les responsables de ces atrocités doivent être traduits en justice. L'Union soutient toutes les mesures visant à ce que leurs auteurs répondent de leurs actes. Elle appuie la commission d'enquête créée par ce Conseil, les enquêtes lancées par le procureur de la Cour pénale internationale, ainsi que par plusieurs pays appliquant la compétence universelle. Elle soutient le travail de la mission de surveillance des droits de l'homme en Ukraine. L'Union a d'emblée condamné l'inacceptable invasion de l'Ukraine par la Russie. La Russie doit se retirer de l'ensemble du territoire ukrainien. Elle doit le faire immédiatement, intégralement et sans condition. La Russie doit se conformer à ses obligations internationales, à ses obligations en matière de droits de l'homme et de droits humanitaires. Nous exigeons la mise en place immédiate de corridors humanitaires pour l'évacuation sûre et volontaire des civils vers la destination de leur choix. Monsieur le Président, l'invasion de l'Ukraine par la Russie a de graves répercussions dans le monde entier. Une crise alimentaire et énergétique mondiale menace. Les agriculteurs ukrainiens sont dans l'impossibilité de cultiver leurs terres et la Russie bloque plusieurs centaines de navires transportant des tonnes de céréales dans les ports ukrainiens de la mer Noire. La Russie accuse les sanctions. Or, les sanctions de l'Union ne visent pas les produits alimentaires. Au contraire, elles prévoient des exceptions pour ces produits essentiels. C'est la guerre choisie par la Russie qui provoque la flambée des prix des denrées alimentaires, poussant les gens dans la pauvreté, menaçant de déstabiliser des régions entières. L'Union européenne intensifie son action multilatérale en aide aux pays confrontés à l'insécurité alimentaire. Elle s'efforce de maintenir ouvertes les routes commerciales pour que les produits de base puissent nourrir le monde. Elle s'est engagée à consacrer 2,5 milliards d'euros à la coopération internationale en matière de nutrition sur la période 21-24. Monsieur le Président, nous l'avons dit et le répétons, il y a un agresseur dans cette guerre, c'est la Russie. Ce n'est ni l'OTAN, ni l'Europe, ni l'Ukraine. Manifestons aujourd'hui la solidarité de la communauté internationale avec le peuple ukrainien et avec tous ceux qui sont touchés par les conséquences de l'agression russe. Je vous remercie.
Merci. Je donne la parole à Luxembourg. Son Excellence Jean Asselborn, ministre des Affaires étrangères de Luxembourg. Par vidéo.
Le Luxembourg s'associe pleinement à la déclaration présentée ici par l'Union européenne. Le Luxembourg réitère son soutien sans faille à la souveraineté, à l'indépendance et à l'intégrité territoriale de l'Ukraine, ainsi que sa solidarité avec la population en Ukraine qui depuis 11 semaines maintenant est victime d'une guerre injustifiée et injustifiable menée par la Russie. Depuis le début de cette guerre, nous sommes devenus témoins des pires crimes dont l'humanité est capable. Les meurtres de civils, y compris de femmes et d'enfants, par les forces armées russes, la destruction ciblée d'infrastructures civiles critiques, telles que des écoles et les hôpitaux, les allégations de violences sexuelles, de torture et de disparitions forcées sont parmi la longue liste de violations du droit international humanitaire et des droits humains dans ce conflit qui constitue des crimes de guerre et des crimes contre l'humanité. De nombreux rapports de tels actes nous sont parvenus des régions occupées par les forces russes après leur libération et continuent à émerger de régions sous contrôle de l'armée russe et des forces séparatistes soutenues par Moscou. Il est essentiel que la commission d'enquête établie par ce Conseil sera enquêté en pleine indépendance pour identifier et rapporter sur chacune de ces violations. Le travail de la communauté internationale dans ce triste contexte devra continuer au-delà des enquêtes. La lutte contre l'impunité est particulièrement importante et il reviendra à la communauté internationale, y compris au Conseil, de mettre tout en œuvre pour s'assurer que les responsables à tous les niveaux de ces crimes soient identifiés et traduits en justice. Le Luxembourg est pleinement engagé dans ce contexte et soutient tous les efforts en cours, en particulier à la Cour pénale internationale. Le peuple ukrainien mérite que nous attribuions clairement et sans hésitation la responsabilité pour les violations des droits humains survenues dans cette néfaste guerre d'agression menée par la Russie, à ceux auxquels elle incombe. Je vous remercie.
Merci. Tiene la palabra Arabia Saudita en nombre del Consejo de Cooperación del Golfo.
السيد الرئيس، ألقي هذا البيان نيابة عن مجموعة دول مجلس التعاون لدول الخليج العربية. لا تزال دول مجلس التعاون تتابع بقلق بالغ تطورات الأحداث الجارية في أوكرانيا، وتعرب عن تأييدها التام لجميع الجهود الرامية لحل الأزمة من خلال المباحثات والحوار ومواصلة العمل من أجل تنفيذ الاتفاقيات المبرمة بين الأطراف المعنية. كما تدعو دول المجلس جميع الأطراف إلى التهدئة وتخفيف التصعيد وبذل كل جهد ممكن لإنهاء هذه الأزمة عاجلا عبر الحوار والطرق الدبلوماسية، وإعطاء فرصة أكبر لإجراء مباحثات تفضي إلى حل سلمي دائم لهذه الأزمة. كذلك تدعو دول المجلس جميع الأطراف للالتزام باحترام قواعد القانون الإنساني الدولي والقانون الدولي لحقوق الإنسان وحماية المدنيين خاصة النساء والأطفال والسماح بوصول المساعدات الإنسانية دون عوائق. وشكرا السيد الرئيس.
Shukran. Tiene la palabra el Reino Unido de Gran Bretaña e Irlanda del Norte.
Presidente, since this council last met, Russia's unprovoked and illegal aggression against Ukraine has continued unabated. This council has a responsibility to protect human rights around the globe, and it's clear that Russia's brutal campaign of violence against the Ukrainian people deserves our ongoing attention. As we meet today, we do so with the greatest admiration for the steadfast resolve of the people of Ukraine. They have not been defeated. Ukraine will prevail. Russia's aggression is an attack first and foremost on those people of Ukraine. But it is also an attack on the fundamental principles of international law and a clear violation of the UN Charter, the legal order that underpins all our security, all our freedoms. We have heard reports, yet again today, of horrifying atrocities in the Irpin and Bucha, including the indiscriminate killing of civilians, of mass graves, of sexual violence and torture. And we have seen evidence of the forced removal of civilians to Russia by Russian armed forces. We have watched in horror the bombardment of towns and cities across Ukraine. In Mariupol, the attacks on the Azovstal steel plant, which left innocent civilians, including women, children, and the elderly, trapped for months without adequate food, water, or medical supplies. We don't yet have the full picture of the atrocities taking place. But already, the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission has verified more than 7,000 civilian casualties, including more than 3,000 deaths. As the High Commissioner said to us this morning, the actual figure of civilians killed must be significantly higher and is still growing. All allegations of violations and abuses of human rights must be investigated thoroughly, and we support the work of this Council's Commission of Inquiry and that of the International Criminal Court. Those responsible for these crimes must be held to account. Mr. President, we cannot look away while this barbarity unfolds. We must show that the international community is watching and that we care, and that Ukraine will win. Slava Ukraini.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra India.
Thank you, Mr. President. We have taken note of the updates on the human rights and humanitarian situation in Ukraine. India's position on the Ukraine conflict has been steadfast and consistent. We remain deeply concerned at the unfolding developments in Ukraine. We have constantly called for immediate cessation of violence and an urgent end to hostilities. Prime Minister Modi has reiterated this in his interactions with global leaders, including leaderships of Russian Federation and Ukraine. India continues to believe that pursuing the path of dialogue and diplomacy is the only way out. We have strongly condemned killings of civilians in Bucha and supported the call for an independent investigation. The situation has further deteriorated since the Council has last discussed this issue in March 2022. We support all efforts to alleviate the sufferings of the people of Ukraine. We believe that the immediate priority should be evacuation of innocent civilians from areas witnessing intense fighting. Mr. President, India has been sending humanitarian supplies, including medicines and other essential relief materials, to Ukraine and its neighbors. We support calls to ensure free and uninterrupted humanitarian access and safe passage for the people. The impact of the situation is being felt beyond the region. Oil prices are skyrocketing. There is also shortage of food, grains, and fertilizers in the world. This destabilization has burdened people around the world, especially in developing and least developed countries. We continue to emphasize that the contemporary global order is anchored on international law, UN Charter, and respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty of all states. We call for respect for and protection of human rights of people in Ukraine and reiterate our abiding commitment to global promotion and protection of human rights. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Informo que la lista de oradores está cerrada. Tiene la palabra Argentina.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Seguimos con mucha preocupación y lamentamos profundamente la guerra en Ucrania y su impacto negativo en el disfrute de los derechos humanos, incluido el derecho a la vida, a la salud, la alimentación, la educación y la vivienda. Reiteramos a la Federación de Rusia que cese inmediatamente en el uso de la fuerza y condenamos enérgicamente la invasión a Ucrania, así como las operaciones militares en su territorio, a la vez que reafirmamos nuestro más firme compromiso con la soberanía, la independencia política, la integridad territorial y la unidad de dicho país. Estamos consternados por los informes de la Oficina de la Alta Comisionada que dan cuenta de reiterados e indiscriminados ataques armados contra zonas pobladas que han matado a miles de civiles y destruido masivamente la infraestructura civil, incluidos hospitales y escuelas, acciones que pueden constituir crímenes de guerra. También nos preocupan profundamente los informes de la Alta Comisionada sobre alegaciones de torturas, ejecuciones extrajudiciales, sumarias o arbitrarias, desapariciones forzadas, violencia sexual y de género y los desplazamientos masivos de la población. Al respecto, instamos a todas las partes en conflicto a que respeten el derecho internacional de los derechos humanos, el derecho internacional humanitario y el derecho internacional de los refugiados, y en particular los principios de distinción de civiles, proporcionalidad y necesidad en el ataque. No habrá una reparación genuina sin la rendición de cuentas por parte de los responsables de las violaciones de derechos humanos y del derecho internacional humanitario. Estas deben ser investigadas, se debe garantizar la justicia y la reparación a las víctimas. Por ello, coincidimos con la Alta Comisionada en que todas las partes beligerantes deben garantizar la preservación de las pruebas relacionadas con las violaciones del derecho internacional humanitario y de los derechos humanos, la correcta identificación y entierro de todos los restos mortales y el registro efectivo y exhaustivo de todas las muertes vinculadas con el conflicto armado. Finalmente, Instamos a las partes en el conflicto a cooperar plenamente con los mecanismos de protección instituidos por este Consejo, incluyendo la Comisión de Investigación, garantizando el acceso completo y sin restricciones a toda la información y a todas las zonas afectadas de Ucrania. Muchas gracias.
Gracias. Agora tem a palavra Brasil, embaixador.
Muito obrigado, Sr. Presidente. 2 months have passed since the Human Rights Council adopted its resolution on the human rights situation in the Ukraine. As the conflict in the country has progressed, we have received an increasing number of reports of alleged gross human rights violations in Ukraine, in towns such as Bucha and Mariupol, and elsewhere. The claims are extremely serious and need to be immediately and independently investigated, which highlights the relevant role to be played by the Commission of Inquiry established by Council Resolution 49/1. We call on all parties to cooperate with the Commission so that it can fulfill its mandate and provide us with unbiased and accurate information on the human rights situation in the Ukraine. Brazil believes that the Commission of Inquiry should proceed quickly with its independent investigation and present early conclusions so that responsibilities can be duly ascertained. It is incumbent upon the Council to base its deliberations and decisions on impartial, objective, and verifiable assessments of the human rights situation on the ground. At this pivotal moment, we renew our call on all parties to exercise maximum restraint, avoid escalation, and resume talks on a much-needed ceasefire, paving the way for a negotiated solution to the conflict. We appeal to all parties to guarantee immediate and unhindered access to humanitarian aid to all regions of Ukraine, as well as the safe evacuation of civilians from conflict-affected areas. We must endeavor to preserve spaces for meaningful and effective dialogue, avoiding measures that contribute to polarize the debate and exacerbate the conflict. In this spirit, we have decided to participate in the current HRC special session on the situation in Ukraine, as well as in other appropriate multilateral fora according to their respective mandates. Brazil considers it important for the Council to continue to monitor the situation in Ukraine. As a human rights body, it has a unique role to play in drawing attention to the plight of individuals affected by the conflict, irrespective of geopolitical or strategic considerations. To that effect, the Council can count on our engagement and cooperation. Brazil will continue to follow the developments on the ground with the utmost attention. We renew our call to all parties to de-escalate tensions and put human lives first. Thank you.
Obrigado. Tiene la palabra Deutschland. Embajadora.
President, Germany aligns with the EU statement. Why are we gathering here today? Is it not enough that we have looked into the war in Ukraine in March? Excellencies, dear colleagues, the very purpose of the Human Rights Council, and I looked it up again in its founding documents, is to promote the universal respect for the protection of human rights. The Human Rights Council is to address situations of violations of human rights. It is up to us, the members of the Human Rights Council, to look closely if and when there are dire human rights violations. And this is exactly what we are doing today. How can the Human Rights Council be silent when basic human rights of millions of people, mothers, fathers, and children are violated in Ukraine, violated by Russia during an unprovoked and unlawful war of aggression? We all heard the words of the High Commissioner earlier today, and I would like to thank her, and as well as all other briefers, for portraying the dire human rights situation and the suffering of the civilian population in such clear words. We must not look away. Bucha, Irpin and Mariupol have become synonymous for the atrociousness of armed conflict and for the suffering that it causes on civilians. As our foreign minister said when she visited Kiev only 2 days ago, those responsible must be brought to justice. We owe this to the victims. Those victims could have been us. Dear colleagues, why does this matter to all of us? Putin's war is not only an attack against Ukraine, it is an attack on all of us. Because Russia is violating our founding principles of international law. The UN Charter, basic international rights treaties such as the two covenants on human rights. It is the primacy of the law that protects all of us. If we do not stand up to these breaches of law, it becomes meaningless. It will not protect any of us anymore, and this will be the victory of the powerful against the weak. Do we want to live in such a world? With the war continuing every single day, the devastating global consequences of Russia's aggression against Ukraine become even more apparent. Food and energy prices are soaring, affecting countries around the world and causing even more human suffering. For all those reasons, we strongly condemn the Russian aggression as well as the disinformation campaign inside and outside its territory, designed to justify the unjustifiable. Mr. President, we stand in solidarity with Ukraine. Thank you.
Danke. Tiene la palabra Lituania.
Thank you, Mr. President. Lithuania aligns itself with the EU statement. We continue to see more and more Ukraine suffering from unprovoked and unjustified military aggression by Russia, its war crimes and other large-scale violations of the international human rights and humanitarian law. We have seen reports of mass atrocities and crimes amounting to genocide committed by the Russian armed forces in Bucha, Borodyanka, Irpin and other places that have now been liberated by Ukraine. The High Commissioner and her team have documented cases of arbitrary detentions and executions of civilians, enforced disappearances of public officials, journalists, media workers and human rights defenders. In Mariupol, we saw mass civilian casualties, indiscriminate and targeted attacks on civil infrastructure and the complete destruction of the city. Russia uses torture, sexual exploitation, rape and other abuses, particularly against women and children, as weapons of war. Russia has forcibly deported around 500,000 Ukrainians, including 180,000 children. Lithuania strongly condemns the shameful Russian disinformation campaign to hide and falsify many of these facts. Moreover, Russian aggression against Ukraine has far-reaching devastating global effects on food security. Obstruction of Ukraine's seaports and transport routes for grain export may lead to famine in several regions of the world. Opening of the ports is crucial. Mr. President, the international community must seek full accountability for the atrocities in Ukraine committed by Russia and its accomplice Belarus. Lithuania supports work of the Commission of Inquiry to ensure accountability for human rights and international humanitarian law violations in Ukraine. Responsibility for human rights violations, crimes against humanity and genocide is the cornerstone. Launch of the investigation by the International Criminal Court and national investigations applying universal jurisdiction are of utmost importance towards accountability. We are convinced that Vilnius communique of the 6th of May by political leaders and experts of international law will contribute to the creation of a special tribunal for the punishment of the crime of aggression against Ukraine. We admire the infinite courage of the Ukrainian people and stand in full solidarity with them. We reiterate our resolute support for the sovereignty, territorial integrity and independence of Ukraine and its democratic future. I thank you.
Thank you. Je donne la parole à la France. Ambassadeur.
Gracias, señor presidente. Monsieur le Président, voilà plus de 10 semaines que la Russie mène en Ukraine une guerre d'agression non provoquée, illégale et injustifiable. Alors que l'Ukraine continue de se battre pour sa souveraineté et pour sa liberté, la France réaffirme son entier soutien au gouvernement et au peuple ukrainien dont elle admire et salue l'héroïque résistance. En envahissant l'Ukraine, la Russie a brutalement violé les principes fondateurs des Nations Unies, notamment le non-recours à la force et le respect de l'intégrité territoriale. L'agression russe s'accompagne chaque jour de découvertes toujours plus macabres et insoutenables, des bombardements aveugles ou le ciblage d'infrastructures civiles, les destructions volontaires d'hôpitaux, de maternités, d'écoles, d'abris, de gares ou de centres commerciaux. La France s'inquiète vivement des graves soupçons de déplacement forcé de civils vers la Russie. C'est à la Russie et à la Russie seule qu'incombe l'entière responsabilité d'avoir fait revenir sur le territoire européen des horreurs telles que les charniers de Boutcha et les fosses communes de Mariupol, ville dont la résistance face aux semeurs de destruction et de mort force le respect. Ce Conseil s'était déjà mobilisé en décidant de mettre en place dès le 4 mars une commission d'enquête indépendante chargée de documenter en toute indépendance ces agissements. Nous en remercions les membres que nous avons pu entendre tout à l'heure. Cette commission a bien sûr tout notre soutien, de même que l'enquête ouverte par le procureur de la Cour pénale internationale. À titre national, la France est aussi mobilisée par l'envoi sur place d'une équipe de gendarmes spécialisés dans les enquêtes sur les crimes internationaux les plus graves. Face à ces actes d'une gravité inqualifiable, étayés par de nombreux témoignages, le Conseil des droits de l'homme se devait à nouveau de prendre ses responsabilités. Il reviendra à la justice ukrainienne et à la justice internationale de connaître de ces violations massives des droits de l'homme et du droit humanitaire, pouvant être constitutifs de crimes de guerre et de crimes contre l'humanité. Nous ne pouvons pas non plus ignorer les conséquences de l'agression russe sur la sécurité alimentaire mondiale et nous devons y faire face de manière solidaire et coordonnée. C'est le sens de l'initiative Farm que la France porte avec ses partenaires européens et du G7. Elle vise à apaiser les tensions sur les marchés agricoles, à renforcer la solidarité avec les pays les plus vulnérables et à continuer à investir dans la production agricole locale. Il sera aussi nécessaire de consacrer davantage de ressources pour répondre aux besoins humanitaires à court terme des populations les plus vulnérables dans le monde. Monsieur le Président, la France soutient pleinement la convocation par l'Ukraine de cette session extraordinaire. Elle appelle l'ensemble des membres de ce Conseil à soutenir la résolution qui sera présentée aujourd'hui. Il en va de la responsabilité du Conseil, mais aussi de l'efficacité et de l'avenir du système multilatéral. Pour que cessent ces violations et ces atteintes aux droits les plus fondamentaux, la France appelle une nouvelle fois la Russie à cesser son agression et à retirer ses troupes d'Ukraine. Je vous remercie.
Merci. And now I give the floor to the United States of America.
Thank you, Mr. President, and to the High Commissioner and Mr. Mose. As Russia realizes its military cannot defeat the indomitable spirit of the people of Ukraine, its frustrations have led to ever more egregious human rights abuses. We see this in the ruthless destruction of Mariupol, in the aftermath of Russia's retreat from the areas around Kyiv, and in the reports of torture, gender-based violence, and execution of civilians, particularly in the areas Russia temporarily holds. Older persons and persons with disabilities have been reported to be especially vulnerable. Faced with Putin's utter disregard for human rights and human life, the international community must continue to use every appropriate tool to make clear that Russia must immediately cease its war of aggression, withdraw its troops from Ukraine, and abide by the UN Charter. Today's special session is instrumental to communicating this message, and it shows that more than a profoundly consequential moment, worldwide efforts to oppose Russia's war and stand up for human rights, sovereignty, and territorial integrity have become a profoundly consequential movement. For our part, the United States imposed on May 8th visa restrictions on over 2,600 Russian military and other officials reportedly involved in actions that threaten or violate Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, or political independence. Included among this group are personnel who reportedly took part in Russian military activities in Bucha. Working together, we must sound a resounding message to those involved in this brutal war of choice and ensure accountability. The United States supports all international efforts to examine atrocities in Ukraine, including those conducted by the International Criminal Court, the United Nations, the Organization on Security and Cooperation in Europe, and others. What's more, the Commission of Inquiry created by this Council will help ensure that Russia does not get away with its continued attempts to hide atrocities. I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra la República de Corea.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Republic of Korea is deeply concerned over Russia's ongoing military aggression against Ukraine and its devastating consequences for civilians. We hear daily reports of increasing civilian casualties, and an alarming scale of displacement. Critical civilian infrastructure has also been destroyed across the country. All this speaks to the gravity of human suffering caused by this war. In particular, my delegation is alarmed by the reported atrocities in Bucha and other liberated towns. We strongly condemn such heinous acts, which are a clear violation of international human rights and humanitarian law. Targeted attacks against innocent civilians cannot be justified under any circumstances. In light of this, we reiterate our strong support for an independent investigation on these atrocities. Those responsible must be held accountable and brought to justice. It is vital that the Commission of Inquiry embarks on a full-fledged investigation with on-site visits. We also fully support the ongoing work of the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine. Mr. President, my delegation is watching with grave concern the evolving situations in besieged cities, including Mariupol. While we welcome the recent evacuation of civilians from Mariupol and Azovstal steel plant, there are people still trapped, being left without access to food, water, and electricity. Safe passage to enable the evacuation of civilians and to deliver life-saving aid to those in need must be guaranteed. Mr. President, over the past months, we have witnessed unspeakable plight of civilians in Ukraine. This must come to an end. My delegation calls on Russia to immediately stop its military aggression and fully respect its obligations under international human rights and humanitarian law. With its unwavering support for Ukraine's sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity, the Republic of Korea stands in solidarity with Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Paraguay.
Muchas gracias, presidente. En primer lugar, celebramos la realización de esta sesión especial. Agradecemos a la coordinadora de la Misión Internacional Independiente, a la alta comisionada para los derechos humanos y al coordinador de los procedimientos especiales por sus tan claras y oportunas informaciones. La República del Paraguay sigue con extrema preocupación la situación en Ucrania. La oficina de la alta comisionada nos informó hace apenas días de más de 7.000 civiles han sido víctimas inocentes en operaciones rusas y nos advierte de que esa cifra puede ser mayor. Miles de personas se han visto obligadas a dejar sus hogares, a convertirse en refugiados o a ser desplazados internos. También se cuentan en millones las niñas y niños que ya no pueden disfrutar ni del más mínimo grado de derechos, los derechos más fundamentales. En este sentido, el Paraguay condena enérgicamente las masacres civiles documentadas en las localidades cerca de Kiev, en Bucha y Mariupol específicamente. Exhortamos fervientemente, señor presidente y señores delegados, a las partes involucradas al alto de un fuego inmediato y a Rusia en particular a garantizar y proteger los derechos humanos de la población afectada, a respetar el derecho internacional humanitario de los refugiados, así como el derecho internacional, en particular el Cuarto Convenio de Ginebra. Los abusos y violaciones de los derechos humanos, aún en situación de conflicto, no deben quedar impunes y por ello el Paraguay apoya y agradece el trabajo de preservación de pruebas de estas violaciones que vienen siendo realizadas en el terreno, a la oficina de la alta comisionada y a los demás órganos que trabajan en esta materia. Hoy en particular nos preocupa mucho la situación descrita por el coordinador de los comités de procedimientos especiales que da cuenta de una hambruna inminente. No podemos, señor presidente y señores delegados, permitir que esto suceda. Los estados y las organizaciones internacionales tenemos la obligación de garantizar la seguridad alimentaria y de que el hambre no sea la prolongación de la actual situación de conflicto y sufrimiento de la población ucraniana. Muchas gracias, presidente.
Muchas gracias. Tiene la palabra Indonesia.
Mr. President, Indonesia deplores the continuing deterioration of human rights in Ukraine. We are particularly alarmed at the report of attacks against civilian infrastructure, including residential areas, schools, and medical facilities. Indonesia once again calls for the immediate end of hostilities and for all parties to pursue a peaceful resolution through dialogue and diplomacy. The safety and security of all persons in Ukraine remain to be our utmost priority. We call for all parties to ensure the safe evacuation of civilians and the rapid, safe, and unhindered access for humanitarian assistance. Mr. President, the conflict in Ukraine is also causing immense adverse impact on the global economy, contributing to food, financial, and energy insecurity. Clearly, this conflict harms all and benefits no one. As President of the G20 this year, Indonesia aimed to ensure that the G20 remain a catalyst for the global economic recovery, and the conflict in Ukraine remain to be a major impediment toward this objective. Only by having peace, security, and stability can the post-pandemic economic recovery and sustainable development goals be achieved. Mr. President, the deteriorating human rights situation in Ukraine is a harrowing case study of how violence against a nation's sovereignty and territorial integrity can only lead to escalation of violence, destruction, and human rights violation. Indonesia therefore reaffirms its unwavering support toward the international legal obligation of all states to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of other states. Any effort to undermine this principle not only undermines the integrity of international law, but also tarnishes state capacities to ensure the protection of human rights. The international community, therefore, has to move in unison to strengthen respect of this time-honored principle. Mr. President, we must not forget that grave violations of human rights are also continuing to happen in other parts of the world. For example, cities under siege, separation of families, destruction of home is also continuing to happen in the occupied Palestinian territory. The effort to call for accountability for human rights violation, therefore, should not be a selective, but rather a universal call. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra México, embajadora.
Gracias, señor presidente. México apoyó la celebración de esta sesión especial en aras de contar con un espacio de diálogo a la luz del deterioro de la situación humanitaria y de derechos humanos en Ucrania. Como lo hemos manifestado en este y otros foros multilaterales, para México la vía pacífica es el único medio para resolver los conflictos. Por ello, continuaremos haciendo llamados a que se mantengan los canales diplomáticos y el diálogo entre las partes. Con este objetivo, el pasado 6 de mayo, promovimos con Noruega una declaración en el Consejo de Seguridad que respalda los esfuerzos del secretario general por encontrar una solución pacífica al conflicto. Nos congratula que haya recibido apoyo unánime de los miembros de dicho Consejo. Rechazamos la agresión cometida en contra de Ucrania y nos preocupa la información proporcionada por la Oficina de la Alta Comisionada y la misión de monitoreo de las Naciones Unidas en este país sobre el registro de al menos 3.459 pérdidas de civiles, incluyendo mujeres, niñas y niños y personas en situación de vulnerabilidad. Nos alarma también la destrucción de escuelas, hospitales y áreas residenciales, el robo de granos y la destrucción de infraestructura del sector agrícola, así como la violencia sexual, transferencia de personas, desapariciones forzadas, tortura y ejecuciones sumarias. Estas acciones podrían implicar violaciones al derecho internacional humanitario y al derecho internacional de los derechos humanos. Por otra parte, si bien reconocemos los esfuerzos del secretario general y del Comité Internacional de la Cruz Roja para lograr la evacuación de civiles en Mariupol, instamos a las partes a asegurar la evacuación inmediata y segura de civiles y heridos de esa y otras ciudades en conflicto. Finalmente, México insta a todas las partes a cesar el fuego de manera inmediata y permanente, a garantizar el respeto pleno del derecho internacional, que particularmente del derecho internacional humanitario, de los derechos humanos y de los refugiados, y a encontrar una solución pacífica a sus diferencias a través del diálogo. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Y tiene la palabra Japón.
Yes, señor presidente. First, we'd like to express that Japan stands with the people of Ukraine who are fighting to defend their sovereignty, territory, and their homeland. Russia's aggression against Ukraine is a serious act shaking the very foundation of the international order. Japan takes extremely seriously the fact that the large number of civilians in Ukraine have been killed as a result of the acts of the Russian forces, and is deeply shocked by this revelation. The killings of innocent civilians is a grave breach of international humanitarian law and absolutely unacceptable. This cannot be allowed to continue. Japan condemns such acts of aggression by Russia in the strongest terms. The CIO, established by the Council under Resolution 49/1, is mandated to investigate all alleged violations and abuses of human rights and violations of international humanitarian law, and collect, consolidate, and analyze evidence of such violation and abuses. The role of the COI is critical. We strongly hope that the COI will begin its work as soon as possible to uncover what has been happening in Ukraine and preserve the evidence. Japan will continue to do its utmost to stop the tragedy unfolding in Ukraine in collaboration with the international community. I thank you.
Arigatou gozaimashita. Pakistán tiene la palabra.
Mr. President, Pakistan reiterates its deep concern over the continuing conflict in Ukraine and its ensuing human rights and humanitarian impacts. We are grieved by the civilian casualties, massive displacement of civilian population, and reported violations of international humanitarian and human rights laws. We renew our call for immediate cessation of hostilities and avoidance of indiscriminate and disproportionate military actions. Respect for basic human rights norms and principles and adherence to international humanitarian law is fundamental to preventing further loss of life and mitigating the humanitarian situation. Pakistan remains a strong advocate for an early and peaceful end to this conflict through dialogue and diplomacy. We encourage continuation of ongoing diplomatic and mediation efforts, protection of human rights and immediate evacuation of civilians from the conflict zone should be among the top priority of such efforts. The international community must continue to respond to this humanitarian crisis by scaling up assistance for the affected ones without discriminating on the basis of race, color, religion, ethnicity, or nationality. On its part, Pakistan had earlier sent over 15 tons of humanitarian assistance for the people of Ukraine, including emergency medicines and food items. We are in the process of dispatching another consignment of humanitarian supplies. Mr. President, the conflict is also exacerbating the existing socio-economic impacts of the COVID pandemic, with energy and food prices hitting the developing countries the hardest. These cascading effects on lives and livelihoods of people around the world deserve adequate attention and redressal. Mr. President, Pakistan reaffirms unequivocal support for the universal and consistent application of the fundamental principles of the UN Charter, including self-determination of peoples, non-use or threat of use of force, respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity of states, pacific settlement of disputes, and equal security for all. We hope the Council's discussions and actions would help advance the cause of peace and safeguard basic rights, freedoms, and dignity of those affected by the conflict. I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Polonia.
Mr. President, Poland aligns itself with the EU statement. Excellencies, 2 months ago, this Council addressed the dire humanitarian human rights consequences of the Russian full-scale military aggression against Ukraine, appalled by the human impact of the hostilities carried out by the invading forces. Since then, the situation has critically deteriorated. The civilian casualties have been constantly increasing as a result of indiscriminate attacks or even of deliberate shelling of the civilian infrastructure. The Russian invasion forced more than 7 million persons, mostly women and children, to leave their homes. Numerous patterns of violations of international humanitarian and human rights law were recently identified by the experts of the OSCE Moscow mechanism. Some of these violations, including deliberate attacks on maternity hospital and the theatre in Mariupol, amount to war crimes. There is no doubt that the present grave humanitarian human rights situation in the city, as well as the barbaric atrocities discovered in the regions of Ukraine liberated from the Russian invading forces, require an utmost attention of this Council. The evidence of massive extrajudicial executions of civilians, in many cases subjected to torture or sexual violence, should be promptly and resolutely investigated, with a view to ensure accountability of all persons who committed these horrific war crimes. At the same time, further human rights violations have to be fully prevented. Poland strongly reiterates its call to the Russian Federation to stop the war, to withdraw all its troops from the entire territory of Ukraine and its internationally recognized borders and international waters, and to respect the lives and rights of every single person in Ukraine. I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Montenegro. Embajadora.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Montenegro welcomes the holding this special session and thanks High Commissioner and the speakers for their updates. Since February 24, we have been constantly witnessing a massive deterioration of the situation on the ground caused by the Russian unprovoked, unjust and illegal aggression against Ukraine, which we strongly condemn. As consistently reported by the Office of High Commissioner, the scale and brutality of human rights violations and violations of international humanitarian law committed by Russian armed forces continue to grow daily, and many of them may amount to war crimes. The number of indiscriminate killings and of civilians and casualties, as well as the large-scale attacks on civilian infrastructure, are grim illustration of the cruelty of Russian aggression. We are shocked and appalled by images and reports from Bucha, Borodyanka, Kramatorsk, Mariupol and other places throughout Ukraine that have been leveled to ashes and where the massacres have been committed by the Russian armed force. Around the world, some of these cities have already become synonymous with horrific crimes of Russian aggression, and we must do everything we can to make them synonymous with justice. The chilling effects of impunity are well known. We have to fight against this by serving justice and ensuring accountability. This is the only way to prevent recurrence of atrocity crimes and the way to help the process of healing the victims, their families and society at large. Also the path to genuine peace and reconciliation. It is therefore imperative that all perpetrators of these atrocities be held to account. For this, Montenegro fully endorses all measures to ensure accountability for human rights violations and violations of international humanitarian law in Ukraine, including the investigation launched by the ICC, work of the established Council Commission on Inquiry on Ukraine, the OSCE, UN monitoring missions, substantive work in collecting and preserving evidence also remains crucial. Mr. President, the draft resolution before us address these violations with a view to strengthening efforts to achieving accountability and bring their perpetrators to justice. With a firm belief that we must remain steadfast and resolute in our efforts to ensure that justice is served, Montenegro has co-sponsored the tabled resolution and encourages everyone to support its consensual adoption. If a vote is called, we invite all Council members to vote in favour. Finally, Montenegro stands in solidarity with the people of Ukraine and reiterates its call to Russia to end the war and to immediately withdraw its forces and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Finlandia.
Finland aligns itself with the EU statement. Finland strongly supports this special session. The rules-based international order functions in holding accountable those responsible for the atrocities. We condemn Russia's illegal and unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine. We call on Russia to cease its use of force and withdraw its military forces from the territory of Ukraine and to fully respect international law. During the ongoing invasion, we have witnessed continuous atrocities, including reports about war crimes and crimes against humanity. These include arbitrary executions, torture, and sexual and gender-based violence. The Russian army has brutally attacked civilians, those trying to flee, those in their homes, schools, hospitals, and those seeking shelter in civilian infrastructure. Thousands of civilians have been killed and injured, including children. Persons in vulnerable situations have been left to suffer. The human and humanitarian costs of these attacks are immeasurable. Finland urges Russia to allow the safe passage for all civilians and the delivery of the humanitarian assistance. This Council has a duty to hold Russia accountable for violations of human rights and humanitarian law. The investigation of the Commission of Inquiry established by this Council in March has a crucial role. It can also contribute to the investigation of the International Criminal Court and other legal proceedings. Finland also firmly supports the investigation by the ICC and the work of the OHCHR monitoring mission in Ukraine. For the rules-based order to deliver, it is important to have comprehensive inquiries of the latest events in Kiev, Cherniv, Kharkiv, Mariupol, and Sumy. Finally, Finland fully supports the resolution presented today. Finland's support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity remains firm. We stand in full solidarity with Ukraine and its people. I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Países Bajos.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Netherlands welcomes the convening of this special session and aligns itself with the EU statement. These are difficult, disturbing, and frustrating times. Many of us know people in Russia, even call them friends. All they want is to be a good parent, provide for the family, enjoy friendship, have a job, like ourselves, like my friends in the Netherlands or anywhere else. People everywhere basically are the same. The difference, however, is that they are part of a system that shows complete disregard for human life and dignity, as we again heard today. They are part of a system that allows its armed forces to commit atrocities and war crimes, as we again heard today. They are part of a system whose president endorses, allows, or encourages sexual and gender-based violence as a method of warfare, as we again heard today. They are part of a system that endorses or encourages violence without any military objective, which is aimed at the destruction of people's souls, which is a violence against humanity itself. As is the war in Ukraine, a serious threat to international peace and security. And that is why, Mr. President, it is crucial that these acts of violence are addressed and adequately investigated. Mr. President, the Netherlands remain gravely concerned by the devastating effects of this war on food, energy, and finance systems, which are likely to have the most impact on least developed and lower and middle income countries. In Ukraine, the destructive power of the Russian invasion is being countered by the power of courageous people. The victims and survivors deserve truth, justice, and accountability. It is for this reason the Netherlands remains strongly committed to the mandate of the Commission of Inquiry, the inquiry into the events in the areas of Kiev, Chernihiv, Kharkiv and Sumy regions, and the ICC investigation. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra China.
主席先生，在乌克兰问题上，中方主张，包括乌克兰在内的各国主权和领土完整都应当得到尊重，联合国宪章的宗旨和原则都应当得到遵守，各国的合理安全关切都应得到重视，一切有利于和平解决危机的努力都应得到支持。推动早日停火止战是国际社会的迫切期待，也是中方的努力方向。中方支持一切有利于缓解乌克兰人道危机的倡议和举措，呼吁当事方尊重国际人道法，采取切实行动保护平民安全，保障妇女、儿童等弱势群体的基本权利和人道需求。中方提出了关于乌克兰人道主义局势的6点倡议，并已经向乌方提供多批紧急人道主义援助。我们认为，各方应共同支持俄乌双方对话谈判，谈出结果，谈出和平，从根本上保障俄乌人民的人权。国际社会要为俄乌谈判创造积极条件，多做有利于政治解决的事情，而不应设置障碍，增添阻力，更不应当火上浇油，激化矛盾。没有一国的安全能够建立在别国的不安全之上。我们应当本着共同、综合、合作、可持续的安全观，共同构建均衡、有效、可持续的全球和地区安全架构。主席先生，我们注意到，近年来人权理事会政治化和对抗性进一步上升，这严重影响人权理事会的公正、客观、信誉和团结。我们希望并呼吁各方回到并且恪守人权理事会成立的初衷，坚持真正的多边主义，共同推动国际人权事业健康发展。我发言稿的全文将上传到人权理事会外联网。谢谢主席先生。
谢谢。Tiene la palabra Nepal.
Mr. President, the continued deteriorating human rights situation in Ukraine, including the loss of human lives, sufferings, and destruction of property over the past months, is disturbing. Nepal reiterates its call on the parties concerned to agree on ceasefire immediately and urge them to engage in diplomacy and dialogue towards resolution of disputes through peaceful means. We view that the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity as enshrined in the UN Charter must be fully respected by all member states, and fundamental human rights of all people should be protected under all circumstances while also respecting the international human rights and humanitarian laws. I thank you.
Thank you. Y tiene la palabra y aprovecho para darle la bienvenida como nuevo miembro de este Consejo de Derechos Humanos, electo recientemente por la Asamblea General. Tiene la palabra la República Checa.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Czech Republic welcomes the convening of this special session, as it is timely and necessary given the worsening human rights situation in Ukraine. The Czech Republic once again strongly condemns the continuous Russian aggression against Ukraine, a flagrant violation of the international law. Mr. President, we are alarmed by the dramatically growing number of civilian casualties. We are horrified by the news of an airstrike on a maternity ward in Mariupol, photos of civilians lying dead on the streets of Bucha, and many other documented atrocities, including reports of widespread sexual and gender-based violence. The perpetrators of these war crimes must be held accountable. Accountability is what the victims deserve. In this respect, it is crucial we all unite and work side by side, both in the international as well as in the national framework. The Czech Republic welcomes the establishment of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine and the swift appointment of experts. We are prepared to fully support the strengthening of its mandate as proposed in the new resolution. Furthermore, the Czech Republic appreciates the report of experts established under the Moscow mechanism of the OSCE, which describes clear patterns of violations of the international humanitarian law and human rights by the Russian forces. We also fully support the investigative work conducted so far by the International Criminal Court. In line with our national legislation, the Czech Republic has also opened domestic criminal investigation on the reported war crimes. Mr. President, we reiterate our call on Russia to withdraw its military forces from Ukraine's territory and to enable safe, timely, and unhindered access of the humanitarian aid to all affected areas in Ukraine. We also urge all member states to unite and show support to Ukraine and the new resolution. I thank you.
Thank you. Y último orador de los Estados miembros tiene la palabra Eritrea.
Thank you, Mr. President. Eritrea expressed concerns on the ongoing conflict and its potential devastation on humanity and calls on the parties to find a lasting solution. Being a victim of several hostilities, my country stands with innocent victims of collateral damage, and the real solution to the root cause of the conflict is long overdue. Fortunately, the debate seeks to drag the Council from human rights warden to a political tool to substitute and continue the failed deliberations of the Security Council and other UN bodies appropriate to resolve the matter. The fact that the Council has never in its history took any action in all of the other similar situations is also worth mentioning. The convening of this special session and the draft resolution do not manifest any solution and defy a balanced assessment. It is with such robust understanding that we reiterate our principled position to reject the convening of the special session. The resolution is simply a repetition of what was already in place. It lacks balance and coherence with human rights principles. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Pasamos ahora a la lista de observadores. Y en primer lugar tiene la palabra Austria, Su Excelencia Peter Launski-Tiefenthal, viceministro de Asuntos Exteriores de Austria, por video.
Mr. President, for over 2 months, Russia has been waging an illegal, unjustified, and unprovoked war against Ukraine. Our full solidarity, therefore, goes out to Ukraine and to the Ukrainian people. Almost on a daily basis, new horrific accounts of war crimes and atrocities reach us. The scale of the onslaught against civilians by Russian forces has become apparent in the regions of Kyiv, Chernihiv, Kharkiv, and Sumy. We are appalled by the reports of sexual violence, torture, and massacres of civilians, including children and the terror spread among the civilian population. This Council cannot remain silent in the face of these atrocities, and we owe the victims and survivors an independent, objective investigation. Therefore, Austria welcomes the proposal by Ukraine to strengthen the existing mandate of the Commission of Inquiry, which operates out of Vienna. Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Rumania, Su Excelencia Cornel Feruta, el Secretario de Estado de Rumania, por video.
Mr. President, Romania commends the convening of this special session. We are looking forward to the adoption of the Council resolution condemning the deteriorating human rights situation in Ukraine. We encourage all Human Rights Council members to vote in favor, reiterating this forum's strong stance in defending international law, including human rights and international humanitarian law, as well as Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. We condemn the atrocities uncovered so far in Ukraine. Russia's unlawful and unprovoked war and attacks against civilians and civilian facilities in complete defiance of international humanitarian law must end. Our common steadfast support for Ukraine is necessary more than ever. No effort should be spared to ensure accountability. There can be no peace without justice. Our country is playing its part. Romania remains committed to help all civilians in need, in Ukraine or seeking refuge in Romania. We joined other state parties to the Rome Statute in a referral to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court to investigate any acts of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide possibly committed on the territory of Ukraine. We support concretely other targeted international efforts to investigate human rights and international humanitarian law violations. Romania stands ready to contributing to this effort and to the rebuilding of Ukraine. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Canadá.
Mr. President, Canada continues to be horrified by President Putin's unprovoked and unjustifiable war on Ukraine. The brutality inflicted on Ukrainians by the Russian forces and the disregard for international humanitarian and human rights law and human life is shocking. As we have heard today, some of the most chilling accounts of violations of international humanitarian law have come out of liberated areas in Mariupol. Russian forces shelled a theater in Mariupol being used as a bomb shelter, instantly killing hundreds of civilians, including children. They blocked civilian access to food, water, and vital medicine, cut off electricity despite freezing temperatures, and attacked civilians trying to escape. Let us be clear, Russia is solely responsible for this crisis. Russia has attacked one of the breadbaskets of the world, destroying Ukraine's capacity to supply the world with food and blockading its ports from being able to export grains and other goods. Russian aggression is impacting the rights and livelihoods of countless who live far and away from the conflict. We've also seen widespread reports of sexual violence, torture, civilians killed in cold blood and their bodies burned, and attacks on schools, hospitals, and residential areas. Canada and the international community will use every tool available to hold the Russian government accountable. We urge it to fulfill its obligations under international humanitarian and human rights law. We will continue to put severe pressure on Russia until Putin stops his war, withdraws his troops and equipment, ends human rights violations, and seeks a diplomatic settlement. Canada stands in solidarity with the people of Ukraine. Thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Colombia.
Gracias, señor presidente. La Organización de Naciones Unidas se fundó con un propósito claro: preservar a las generaciones venideras del flagelo de la guerra. La observación general número 36 del Comité del Pacto Internacional de Derechos Civiles y Políticos concluye que las guerras y otros actos de violencia masiva siguen siendo un flagelo de la humanidad que viola los derechos fundamentales y arrebata cada año la vida de millares de seres humanos inocentes. Debemos mantener nuestras voces unidas para denunciar las violaciones al derecho internacional humanitario y el derecho internacional de los derechos humanos derivadas de la agresión militar contra Ucrania. Colombia, como miembro del Grupo de Amigos por la rendición de cuentas tras la agresión contra Ucrania, suscribe plenamente la declaración conjunta pronunciada por el ministro de Exteriores de Islas Marshall y respalda el mandato de la Comisión Independiente de Investigación establecida por el Consejo. Instamos a la Comisión para que comparta sus hallazgos con la Corte Internacional de Justicia, la Corte Penal Internacional, los órganos de tratados con jurisdicción y competencia según el caso y los procedimientos especiales pertinentes, con el fin de apoyar al pueblo ucraniano en reivindicar su derecho por la verdad, la justicia, la reparación y la garantía de no repetición en relación con la brutal agresión militar de la cual es víctima. Gracias, señor presidente.
Muchas gracias. Tiene la palabra International Development Law Organization.
Thank you, Mr. President. The International Development Law Organization remains deeply concerned by the consequences of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the human displacement and suffering, the global impact on food security, and the risks of broader instability have been devastating. This conflict poses a significant threat to the rule of law and the international system. As the only global intergovernmental organization devoted to promoting the rule of law to advance peace and sustainable development, IDLO emphasizes the urgent need for the full respect of international law, as well as the norms and standards that characterize the commitments states make as members of the multilateral system. The United Nations Charter applies to all nations. At every level, it is critical that we invest in the rule of law. That means investing financially, substantively, and through a steadfast commitment to the principles it entails, such as inclusive governance, equal access to justice, legal empowerment, and compliance with international human rights standards. The rule of law is a cornerstone of peace and development. Over many years, IDLO has worked with the Ukrainian justice institutions to assist the government and people of Ukraine in their efforts to strengthen judicial capacity, improve integrity, and bolster the rule of law. Even in the face of this destructive conflict, the Ukrainian government continues working with IDLO to ensure that its judicial mechanisms can deliver justice. Such tangible investments in the rule of law are more important now than ever. IDLO is pleased to continue its partnership with Ukraine, and we welcome partnering with others to support rule of law engagements in Ukraine and globally. Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Australia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Australia condemns in the strongest possible terms Russia's unprovoked and unjust and illegal invasion of Ukraine. We are appalled by the horrific acts perpetrated by Russian forces, including torture, mass executions, rape, starvation and forced deportations. We are alarmed by reports of a Russian airstrike on unarmed civilians sheltering in a school in Luhansk, resulting in the deaths of around 60 civilians. The deliberate targeting of civilians is a war crime. We are also deeply concerned by the impact of Russian aggression on the global food crisis, particularly its effect on the poorest and most vulnerable across the world. We call on Russia to immediately cease hostilities and withdraw its forces from Ukrainian territory. Russia must respect its obligations under international humanitarian and human rights law and ensure protection and safety for all people, including persons with disabilities. The Commission of Inquiry will be critical to investigating and reporting on evidence of abuses of human rights and violations of international humanitarian law and related crimes, including in Kyiv, Cherniv, Kharkiv and Sumy regions, and to holding perpetrators accountable. Australia's support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity and for the people of Ukraine is unwavering. We join calls for the High Commissioner to report on the situation in Mariupol at the 50th session of the Human Rights Council. Thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Perú.
Gracias, presidente. Agradecemos a la alta comisionada por su presentación y por los arduos esfuerzos que despliega su oficina. Con el apoyo de la República del Perú, este Consejo se ha visto nuevamente en la necesidad de abordar de urgencia las graves y persistentes denuncias de violaciones de los derechos humanos y el derecho internacional humanitario en Ucrania, a raíz de la agresión rusa que el Perú ha condenado firmemente, muchas de las cuales podrían constituir crímenes de guerra. Expresamos nuestro rechazo al bombardeo indiscriminado de zonas habitadas, causando la muerte de civiles y destrozando hospitales, escuelas y otras infraestructuras civiles. Nos alarman las crecientes acusaciones de violencia sexual contra mujeres, hombres, niñas y niños y reafirmamos la importancia de garantizar a las víctimas el acceso a servicios de apoyo adecuados y seguros. Condenamos los reportes sobre la magnitud de las ejecuciones sumarias de civiles que han ocurrido en zonas ocupadas, como en Busha. Exhortamos a que estos y otros sucesos, como casos de detenciones arbitrarias, desapariciones forzadas y de uso de tortura, se investiguen a cabalidad. Señor presidente, demandamos el estricto respeto del derecho internacional humanitario y el derecho internacional de los derechos humanos y que se tomen todas las medidas necesarias para proteger a la población civil. Instamos a las partes a redoblar esfuerzos por encontrar una solución diplomática, pacífica y negociada en cumplimiento de los principios y obligaciones contenidas en la Carta de las Naciones Unidas. Muchas gracias.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Irlanda.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ireland aligns with the EU statement and thanks the High Commissioner and other speakers for their updates. Ireland is appalled by the scale of civilian casualties and destruction being caused daily by Russia's illegal and unjustifiable invasion of Ukraine. We reiterate our call for an immediate cessation of hostilities and withdrawal of Russian armed forces from within Ukraine's internationally recognised borders. The level of suffering being inflicted on the civilian population is unconscionable. We are horrified by the increasing number of allegations of sexual violence committed by Russian armed forces. We condemn utterly the use of sexual and gender-based violence, which has devastating lifelong consequences for individuals and communities. We stress also the disproportionate impact of the conflict on older persons and persons with disabilities. Russia's flagrant disregard for international human rights and humanitarian law must not be tolerated. Ireland strongly supports the vital work of OHCHR, the Human Rights Monitoring Mechanism and the Commission of Inquiry and other international mechanisms to ensure perpetrators of violations and abuses are held to account. It is essential that the Commission of Inquiry is provided with the necessary resources and relevant expertise to carry out its mandate effectively. The international community must maintain its clear and unequivocal demand for peace, justice and respect for international law and human rights. Ireland strongly supports this special session and calls for the adoption of the resolution by consensus. Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Ecuador. Embajador.
Señor presidente, Ecuador expresa su profunda preocupación por el grave deterioro de la situación de los derechos humanos en Ucrania, a causa de la agresión militar perpetrada por Rusia, la que hemos condenado por violar la soberanía, independencia e integridad territorial de Ucrania. Dicha agresión vulnera el derecho internacional y los principios y propósitos de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, la paz, la seguridad y el respeto a la igualdad soberana de los Estados. Ecuador reitera su firme llamado para que Rusia ponga fin a la incursión militar en Ucrania y se produzca el cese inmediato de las hostilidades. Insistimos en la necesidad de una solución pacífica del conflicto a través de negociaciones que permitan restaurar la paz. El conflicto bélico es la negación total de los derechos humanos, con consecuencias humanitarias devastadoras. La situación de la población civil en Ucrania se deteriora día a día de manera inaceptable y requiere urgente protección, particularmente para mujeres, niños y personas en situación de vulnerabilidad. Condenamos enérgicamente la violación del derecho internacional humanitario, los reiterados ataques contra la población civil, infraestructura civil, escuelas y hospitales, así como el uso de tortura, desapariciones forzadas, ejecuciones extrajudiciales y violencias de género. Reiteramos la necesidad de investigaciones independientes e imparciales que lleven a los responsables ante la justicia y que permita una reparación efectiva para las víctimas. Finalmente, instamos a que se respete plenamente el derecho internacional de los derechos humanos, el derecho internacional humanitario y el derecho internacional de los refugiados y se garantice el acceso de ayuda humanitaria sin restricciones. Gracias.
Gracias. Agora tem a palavra Portugal.
Senhor Presidente, Portugal aligns with the statements by the European Union and by the Group of Friends on accountability. Portugal unequivocally condemns the unprovoked aggression by Russia against Ukraine. The images and the reports we are getting portray a somber scenario of human suffering. We shall not forget the atrocities committed in Bucha or Mariupol, the indiscriminate attacks against civilian and infrastructures like schools and hospitals, reports of torture, arbitrary executions, sexual and gender-based violence, and crimes against children. Portugal will support the investigations carried out by the Commission of Inquiry and considers the investigation launched by the ICC prosecutor a key step for accountability. Mr. President, military hostilities must cease. Humanitarian corridors must be preserved. Portugal will continue to welcome Ukrainians who seek refuge in our country and continue supporting Ukraine and its people. The Council shall continue to speak up for all those affected directly by this conflict and also for all around the globe and in other crisis settings who suffer the indirect consequences of this aggression. Gracias.
Obrigado. Tiene la palabra Latvia.
Thank you, Mr. President. We are appalled by the increasing number of reports of atrocities committed by the Russian armed forces. We strongly condemn forced deportations of Ukrainians to Russia, including children and their illegal adoptions in Russia. This is not the first time Russia has used forced deportations to decimate the occupied nation. For example, in 1941, the USSR forcibly deported approximately 100,000 people from the Baltic states, Ukraine, Moldova, and Belarus to the far regions of Russia. Most of them died in exile. Latvia fully supports the work of all relevant accountability mechanisms, including the ICC investigation and the work of the Commission of Inquiry. We are also deeply concerned about the suffering the Russian aggression is causing in other regions of the world. The disruption to food systems and markets has led to decreased food availability and increased food prices. And this is not caused by sanctions. It is the direct result of Russia's blockade of Black Sea ports, preventing the export of tons of wheat, grain, and corn. As long as Russia's invasion of Ukraine continues, food security worldwide will keep deteriorating. In conclusion, Latvia, more than ever, affirms its unwavering support to the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Nueva Zelanda.
Thank you, Mr. President. New Zealand associates itself with the statement delivered by the Marshall Islands on behalf of the Group of Friends on Accountability. We continue to be alarmed at the reports of egregious human rights abuses inside Ukraine and the worsening humanitarian crisis. Russia's blatant disregard for the impact of war on the lives of civilians, especially women, children, and persons with disabilities, is central to this crisis. We reiterate our call for an immediate end to Russian hostilities against Ukraine. The situation on the ground is worsening. Reports are emerging of deliberate abuses of human rights in multiple towns and cities. New Zealand recently announced that we will provide $1 million to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to support ongoing monitoring and accountability. We are also concerned by and actively monitoring the negative impacts on human security and human rights beyond Ukraine due to food shortages and other flow-on effects of Russian aggression. We have concerns for the protection of the human rights of those people who have been transferred from Ukraine and are in Russia or areas occupied by Russian forces. We call for transparency and international access to these people. We condemn the use of weapons in violation of international law and norms, including cluster munitions, and categorically reject all threats to use nuclear weapons which would have devastating effects for humanity. We welcome also the call for the High Commissioner to present an update on the situation in Ukraine to the upcoming 50th regular session of the Council. The international community must continue to send a clear message to Russia. We are watching and your actions have consequences. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra la Soberana Orden de Malta.
Mr. President, the Sovereign Order of Malta remains deeply concerned by the current war in Ukraine and supports the draft resolution before this special session. This tragic situation has forced 5 million people to flee the country while causing the internal displacement of more than 7 million. My delegation should like to confirm here our strong humanitarian commitment to alleviate the terrible suffering of the Ukrainian people. The Order of Malta, through its associations, relief and voluntary corps, and by means of its diplomatic network, is continuing to deliver relief and basic goods to the population in need, both in Ukraine and in the neighboring countries. Projects for displaced people targeting children in particular continue both in western and eastern Ukraine. Accommodation is provided to displaced people in Lviv and Ivano-Frankivsk, and in Berehovo, the Order of Malta Ukraine manages a war horse in charge of the distribution of relief goods to IDPs, despite the lack of security and the difficulties of access. In Poland and Hungary, services for incoming refugees include shuttle services, medical points, and food distribution. In Romania, Slovakia, and Lithuania, the Order of Malta supports the relief operations by distributing aid. The Italian Relief Corps of the Order of Malta has deployed teams of volunteers to Romania. Many other national associations of the Order of Malta across Europe, let's mention here Germany and France in particular, but also in the United States, have offered support by organizing fundraising campaigns and shipping humanitarian goods. I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Nicaragua.
Representante de los Estados miembros, señoras y señores miembros y observadores. La lucha por la paz y el establecimiento de un orden internacional justo son compromisos irrenunciables de la nación y pueblo de Nicaragua. Consecuentes con nuestros principios y vocación de paz, a lo largo de nuestra historia nos hemos expresado oponiéndonos a todas las formas de guerra y a todo lo que rompa la paz, la armonía y la vida con trabajo y derechos que merecemos todos los pueblos del mundo. Nuestro gobierno y pueblo ha manifestado en foros y organismos internacionales su vocación y compromiso permanente con la paz en el mundo y los mecanismos de diálogo para propiciarla, así como el respaldo humanitario a todos los esfuerzos humanitarios que deben asumirse con todo respeto y neutralidad ante conflictos que ponen en riesgo la seguridad y la vida en todas sus formas. Nicaragua reitera su posición sobre el rol que debe desempeñar Naciones Unidas ante las circunstancias que vive la Federación de Rusia y Ucrania. Esta organización debe retomar su papel constructivo e imparcial en la resolución de conflictos, dando prioridad a la paz y la seguridad universal de todos los países, evitando mayores tensiones. Los hechos que acontecen en razón de los derechos humanos, en particular la pérdida de vidas, son evitables si la Carta de las Naciones Unidas no fueran violadas constantemente por las continuas políticas injerencistas en los asuntos internos de los Estados. Ejemplo de ello es el golpe de Estado en Ucrania en el 2014 y los ataques y bombardeos contra la población de Donetsk y Lugansk, provocando la muerte de miles de personas. Es el antecedente de lo que hoy vivimos y que afecta a los derechos humanos a nivel global con la práctica de medidas unilaterales en defensa de los intereses geopolíticos de Occidente.
Muchas gracias. Tiene la palabra Suiza.
La Suisse condamne avec la plus grande fermeté l'agression de la Fédération de Russie contre l'Ukraine en rappelant que le respect des droits de l'homme et du droit international humanitaire incombe à toutes les parties. La Fédération Russie a attaqué l'Ukraine sans aucune justification. Justice doit être rendue aux victimes de cet acte qui va à l'encontre des règles fondamentales de notre ordre international. Tous les crimes de droit international tels que commis à Boutcha, des attaques contre des civils à la gare de Kramatorsk ou encore au théâtre de Mariupol, pour ne mentionner que les crimes les plus connus, doivent faire l'objet d'enquêtes indépendantes. Les auteurs des violations graves des droits de l'homme et du droit international humanitaire doivent être identifiés et traduits en justice. Il est fondamental que ce processus soit centré sur les besoins des victimes. À ces fins, la Suisse soutient, entre autres, le travail de la mission d'observation des droits de l'homme des Nations Unies pour l'Ukraine, les enquêtes menées par la Cour pénale internationale et la commission d'enquête du Conseil des droits de l'homme. Nous appelons toutes les parties à coopérer pleinement avec de tels mécanismes et à fournir l'accès approprié. Pour conclure, nous saluons la contribution positive de l'ONU et du CICR dans l'évacuation de la plupart des civils de l'usine Azovstal et nous encourageons la poursuite des évacuations. Je vous remercie.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Albania.
Mr. President, Albania aligns with the statement delivered by the Honorable Minister of the Marshall Islands on behalf of the Group of Friends of Accountability following the aggression against Ukraine. We wish to thank the OHCHR, especially the Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, for their work to date in documenting violations of international humanitarian law and violations of human rights law in Ukraine. The brutality of Russia's unprovoked, unjustified, and illegal attack upon Ukraine is shocking. This is Russia's war of choice, a premeditated aggression against a sovereign country, a choice to commit unspeakable atrocities, a horror story of violations perpetrated against civilians, in the words of the High Commissioner. Russian forces retreating from Bucha and other Ukrainian towns left a shocking trail of violence behind. We can only imagine the situation in besieged Mariupol. Russia's unlawful aggression against Ukraine must end. It is crystal clear that there can be no impunity for the torrent of atrocities committed against the people of Ukraine. The victims of Russia's illegality have the right to truth, justice, and reparations. The Commission of Inquiry can play a key role in advancing accountability in Ukraine, and we wish to assure the Commission of Albania's full support, including for the strengthening of its mandate. I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra la República de Moldova. Por video.
Mr. President, the war in Ukraine has been ravaging for 78 days now, while we are still struggling with just voicing the word war. The brutality inflicted on Ukraine, on its men, women, children, is outrageous. At least 226 children dead and hundreds wounded, although no one knows the real number. Over 2,000 children born in war in most inhuman conditions. Since the last dialogue on Ukraine, the situation has only worsened with countless violations of human rights and international humanitarian law. We are pleading yet again for the Russian Federation to stop its military aggression, immediately remove its troops from Ukraine, and respect international humanitarian law. The forced transfers of population, along with reported use of torture and other cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment, arbitrary execution or sexual violence, are deeply appalling. We join the previous speakers in urging the Russian Federation to share a comprehensive list of transferred persons and allow international staff unhindered access to those persons. To conclude, I would like to reiterate our strong commitment to accountability and support for the comprehensive and independent investigations conducted by the Commission of Inquiry. Thank you.
Perdón, tiene la palabra Malta.
President, Malta aligns itself with the statement of the European Union. For decades, this time of the year has been associated with commemorating a liberated Europe, embracing democracy, the rule of law, and human rights. Today, however, we are here at the Human Rights Council, again condemning the premeditated invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation. Instead of celebrating the end of World War II and peace in Europe, we are remembering the innocent civilian victims of conflict in Kiev, Kharkiv, Bucha, Mariupol, and numerous other cities in Ukraine. For weeks we have witnessed the cruel onslaught in Mariupol, leading to wide-scale destruction of the city. Thousands of inhabitants have been deported or forcibly displaced. We call for immediate and unhindered access to humanitarian assistance by refugees and other displaced people. Malta calls upon Russia to immediately cease all hostilities, withdraw all its military from Ukraine, and fully respect Ukraine's territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence. We reiterate that diplomacy and dialogue must prevail, and we expect that international law, internationally recognized borders, international human rights and humanitarian law are fully respected and accountability ensured. Finally, we join others in expressing our full support and solidarity with the government and people of Ukraine. I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Suecia.
Mr. President, Sweden fully aligns itself with the European Union. Sweden stands in solidarity with Ukraine and its people. Our steadfast support will continue. We condemn the Russian Federation's unprovoked aggression against Ukraine in the strongest terms. It is a flagrant violation of international law, including the UN Charter. We also condemn the involvement of Belarus in the aggression. Russia must respect IHL. We have been horrified by recent discovery of mass graves which bears witness to the crimes committed by Russia. Reports of sexual assault and rape by Russian armed forces are appalling. Abductions of local representatives are deeply concerning and utterly unacceptable. The repeated attacks against civilians must stop. We are running out of adjectives strong enough to describe the horrors committed by Russian forces in Ukraine. All violations of human rights and IHL must be systematically documented and investigated. We welcome the investigations of the Commission of Inquiry and the ICC. These and similar investigations are also an important deterrence. The world is watching. Perpetrators must and will be held to account. I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Беларусь.
Благодарю вас, господин председатель. Беларусь сожалеет, что трагические события гибели и страдания гражданского населения в Украине становятся для группы государств не предметом скорейшего дипломатического урегулирования, но разменной монетой в геополитических играх. На это указывает многое, в том числе и проект резолюции нынешней спецсессии, который однобоко интерпретирует причины кризиса и действия сторон конфликта. С обеспокоенностью отмечаем ухудшение гуманитарной ситуации в Украине, жертвы среди мирного населения, разрушение социальной инфраструктуры, продолжающуюся практику удержания гражданских лиц против их воли в зонах боестолкновений. Мы обеспокоены тем, что конфликт в Украине превращается в прибыльное дело для ряда западных государств, которые накачивают его оружием. Этот бизнес на крови мир уже видел в разных регионах, и он всегда сопровождался жертвами мирных людей. Сегодня он подливает масло в огонь конфликта в Украине. Это может стать триггером для необратимых человеческих потерь и новых вызовов в сфере региональной безопасности, контроля над вооружениями, борьбы с терроризмом. Этого допустить нельзя. Мы вновь подчеркиваем необходимость урегулирования конфликта в Украине за столом переговоров и призываем страны и международные институты сделать ставку на политико-дипломатические усилия, а не на эскалацию и поддержку войны. Беларусь заинтересована в скорейшем наступлении мира в Украине и готова всячески содействовать поиску политико-дипломатических компромиссов. Благодарю вас.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Macedonia del Norte.
Mr. President, today it is the 78th day of the blatant and unprovoked aggression of Russian forces against Ukraine. The ongoing assaults have turned Mariupol into a ghost town, Bucha into a mass grave, and has forced a third of Ukrainians to flee their country or displace internally. This war is spiraling out of control. Every single death of a child is one too many. We are horrified by the atrocities of the Russian military and paramilitary troops against innocent Ukrainian civilians. We cannot close our eyes in the face of thousands of massacres, torture, and widespread reports of sexual violence, including children. We stand with the people of Ukraine and reiterate our unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. We insist that all perpetrators of violence and abuse of human rights and international humanitarian law are held accountable. Hence, North Macedonia wholeheartedly welcomes Ukraine's proposal to strengthen the existing mandate of the Human Rights Council's Commission of Inquiry. Excellencies, dear colleagues, can we raise the black color from the little boy's drawing shown by the Ukrainian deputy minister? As Martin Luther King said, our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Italia. Ambassador.
Italy aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union and expresses deep concern for the further deterioration of the human rights situation in Ukraine, the increasing number of civilian casualties, and the ongoing humanitarian catastrophe caused by the unprovoked and unjustified military aggression by the Russian Federation against a sovereign country. The horrific developments and the unbearable human suffering recently documented by the OHCHR and other international organizations throughout Ukraine are shocking. The continual large-scale targeting of civilian infrastructures, including medical and education facilities, is unacceptable. We are particularly concerned by the situation of women and girls, children, persons with disabilities, and all other persons in vulnerable situations, as well as by the allegation of sexual and gender-based violence. These atrocities and violations of international law must stop immediately, and those responsible must be brought to justice. Therefore, we renew our strong support for all efforts aimed at ensuring full accountability, including by the Commission of Inquiry, the OSCE Moscow mechanism, as well as the International Criminal Court. We are also extremely worried about the global economic challenges and negative impact of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, including on food security, in particular in the least developed countries. Italy renews once again its call on Russia to fully comply with its obligation under international law, immediately cease all military actions, and ensure safe corridors to evacuate the civilian population. In conclusion, I wish to reaffirm Italy's full solidarity and support for Ukraine and its people. I thank you.
Grazie. Tiene la palabra Dinamarca.
Mr. President, Denmark aligns itself with the statement by the EU. We reiterate our condemnation in the strongest possible terms of the unlawful Russian aggression against Ukraine. Every day we hear news of new horrific crimes committed by the Russian forces. We are appalled by the use of cluster ammunition and indiscriminate targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure. Crimes involve summary executions, torture and other ill treatment, arbitrary arrests, enforced disappearances, and sexual and gender-based violence, and may amount to war crimes. We remain deeply concerned about the impact of the Russian aggression on food security and the right to food, affecting in particular developing countries. We call upon Russia to immediately end its violence against civilians and civilian infrastructure and urge the full and immediate withdrawal of Russian forces from Ukraine. Holding perpetrators to account is important for prevention, the international rule-based order, and future peace and reconciliation. We must insist on achieving accountability and justice for victims. I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Chile.
Señor presidente, queremos iniciar nuestra intervención recordando a las víctimas de la brutal guerra que tiene lugar en Ucrania, ocasionada por una invasión que viola normas de derecho internacional, del derecho internacional humanitario y la Carta de Naciones Unidas. El gobierno de Chile desea expresar nuevamente su profunda preocupación por la agresión armada de Rusia y la violación de la soberanía e integridad territorial de Ucrania. La gravedad de los hechos requiere mantener una respuesta rápida y contundente de este Consejo de Derechos Humanos y de la comunidad internacional, colaborando con el fin del conflicto y la rendición de cuentas. Señor presidente, Chile condena de manera categórica el uso de la fuerza en las relaciones internacionales y reiteramos el llamado al diálogo para encontrar una solución pacífica al conflicto, según lo establecido en el artículo 2 de la Carta de Naciones Unidas. Es por esto que hacemos un llamado a Rusia para que retire sus tropas, respete la integridad territorial y soberanía de Ucrania y evite la pérdida de más vidas inocentes y daños materiales, respetando los convenios de Ginebra. Chile abriga la esperanza de que prevalezca el diálogo y las negociaciones para prevenir un mayor escalamiento de este conflicto y que amenaza la paz y la seguridad internacional. Para finalizar, manifestamos la solidaridad del pueblo de Chile con los millones de personas en Ucrania afectadas por esta guerra. Muchas gracias.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Liechtenstein.
Thank you, Mr. President. Liechtenstein supported the convening of this special session to address the deterioration of the human rights situation in Ukraine as a result of the Russian aggression against Ukraine. We would like to thank the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the Chair of the Coordination Committee, as well as the members of the Commission of Inquiry for their respective statements. We are appalled by the systematic and widespread violations of human rights and humanitarian law in Ukraine, amounting to war crimes and crimes against humanity, overwhelmingly attributable to the Russian armed forces. The horrible pictures from Bucha, Mariupol, Kharkiv, and other places in Ukraine have rendered us speechless. We are worried about the high number of civilian casualties in the conflict and stress in this respect the need for comprehensive, verifiable, and transparent records of casualties. Liechtenstein strongly condemns the indiscriminate shelling and bombing of populated areas and the deliberate targeting of hospitals, schools, and other civilian objects. We stress the importance of respecting human rights and humanitarian law in this conflict. We welcome the swift appointment of the members of the Commission of Inquiry as an important step to start the investigation into the crimes committed in Ukraine in view of holding the perpetrators of these crimes accountable. Moreover, we welcome the launch of an investigation into the situation in Ukraine by the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. In conclusion, I would like to reiterate Liechtenstein's strong support for the Commission of Inquiry. I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Noruega.
Thank you, Mr. President. Russia has chosen to start an unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine. Norway condemns Russia's violation of international humanitarian law and violations and abuses of human rights. Norway calls on Russia to stop the deliberate targeting and destruction of civilian infrastructure, such as homes, hospitals, and schools. There are abundant credible reports of arbitrary executions and torture of civilians, enforced disappearances and forced transfer of population to Russia, and the use of conflict-related sexual violence as a weapon of war. Such atrocities must be investigated and those responsible held to account. Norway supports the work of the OHCHR. We welcome the establishment of the Commission of Inquiry and urge all member states to ensure that it has sufficient financial resources and specialist expertise. Mr. President, Russia's invasion will have serious effects on global food security. The war has disrupted production and change of supply, and this will have a devastating impact on the most vulnerable people in all regions. This is Russia's responsibility. We urge Russia to stop the war. Russia must immediately, completely and unconditionally withdraw all of its military forces from the territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Syria.
السيد الرئيس، تؤمن سوريا بأهمية دور هذا المجلس في تعزيز وحماية حقوق الإنسان بالاستناد إلى مبادئ العالمية والموضوعية بعيدا عن التسييس والمعايير المزدوجة. إن عقد هذه الدورة الخاصة بعد أقل من شهرين على جلسة النقاش العاجل للمجلس حول أوكرانيا وإعادة تدوير مضمون القرار الذي سبق اعتماده يأتي في سياق تحرك غربي ممنهج للتشهير بالاتحاد الروسي وخدمة لأجندات تسعى لتصعيد الأوضاع في أوكرانيا وعرقلة التوصل إلى حل سلمي. إن إسهام المجلس بتسوية النزاع يتطلب تناول أوضاع حقوق الإنسان في أوكرانيا بطريقة غير انتقائية والتخلي عن سياسة تجاهل الانتهاكات الممنهجة لحقوق الإنسان والفظائع المرتكبة بحق سكان الدونباس، والإقرار بأن فرض التدابير القسرية الأحادية غير القانونية ضد روسيا الاتحادية وإغراق أوكرانيا بالأسلحة الفتاكة والمرتزقة يؤكد رغبة الدول الغربية بتصعيد الأزمة والاستمرار بتهديد الأمن القومي الروسي. سوريا تعتبر أن عقد هذه الجلسة ومشروع القرار المعروض عليها الذي يتجاهل هذه الحقائق ويسعى لتوجيه اللوم لروسيا الاتحادية بشكل انتقائي يعبر عن نهج أثبت فشله في تناول قضايا حقوق الإنسان بطريقة منصفة وغير تمييزية وتحث أعضاء المجلس على رفضه. شكرا.
Shukran. Tiene la palabra Bulgaria.
Gracias, Presidente. Bulgaria aligns itself with the statement made by the European Union. Bulgaria has been consistently supporting the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders and stands firmly behind the Ukrainian people, the democratically elected institutions of Ukraine and their choice of a free and democratic Ukraine pursuing its European path. We reiterate our condemnation in the strongest possible terms of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, accompanied by gross human rights violations and breaches of international humanitarian law. We condemn the reported atrocities committed by the Russian armed forces in Ukraine. The attacks against the civilian population in Ukraine, the loss of lives, and the destruction of civilian infrastructure they bring are absolutely unacceptable and should be investigated. We urge the Human Rights Council to act swiftly at this session and to ensure that those responsible for violations and abuses of international human rights law and violations of international humanitarian law in Ukraine be held accountable. We expect the Commission of Inquiry created to this effect to become fully operational as soon as possible. We call on Russia to fully comply with its obligations under international humanitarian law and to ensure safe and unhindered humanitarian assistance and access to all those in need, including women, children, the elderly and the disabled. We are profoundly concerned that the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine has already led to the displacement of more than 13 million people. Bulgaria has received by now more than 230,000 Ukrainian refugees. We will continue to provide further support to the suffering people of Ukraine. For all these reasons, Bulgaria supported the convocation of this special session and calls on all Human Rights Council members to support the adoption of the draft resolution tabled by Ukraine. Thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Uruguay.
Gracias, señor presidente. Uruguay sigue con profunda preocupación la situación de derechos humanos en Ucrania, como resultado de la agresión militar de la Federación Rusa, reafirmando su más firme condena a esta flagrante violación del derecho internacional. Lamentamos profundamente el impacto del conflicto en la población civil que incluye a niños cuyas vidas y derechos humanos están siendo gravemente afectados. Al mismo tiempo, reiteramos nuestro llamado para un inmediato cese al fuego, así como el apoyo a la continuidad de los esfuerzos diplomáticos y de negociación como única fórmula para alcanzar una pronta solución que permita y garantice una paz sostenible. Uruguay reafirma su respaldo al mecanismo de investigación creado por este Consejo en el mes de marzo pasado, esperando que el mismo pueda cumplir con su importante mandato de manera independiente e imparcial, con acceso a todo el territorio de Ucrania. Asimismo, manifestamos nuestro firme apoyo a los trabajos de monitoreo que han venido desempeñando la Oficina de la Alta Comisionada y los procedimientos especiales de este Consejo, haciendo eco de sus preocupaciones sobre el grave impacto del conflicto en los derechos humanos. Confiamos que el Consejo podrá seguir cumpliendo en forma eficaz con sus importantes responsabilidades en relación a este lamentable conflicto, lo que nuevamente demostrará el compromiso que sigue teniendo la mayoría de la comunidad con el respeto al derecho internacional y humanitario. En este sentido, apoyamos el proyecto de resolución presentado en esta oportunidad. Muchas gracias.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Turquía.
Mr. President, we support Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, including Crimea. We reject breaches of fundamental principles of the UN Charter and the military aggression on Ukraine. This war is wrong. It should not have started in the first place. Now we have all the terrible consequences of war, including great human suffering, death, and the violations of international human rights and humanitarian law, as documented by the Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine. We are also concerned by the long-term and broader consequences of the conflict on human rights in Ukraine and the world at large. The international community cannot afford the potential risks of such serious regional and even global complications. Images from various districts around Kiev, including Bucha and Irpin, as well as from Mariupol and other Ukrainian cities, are appalling. We share the pain of the people of Ukraine. Targeting innocent civilians and civilian infrastructure can never be accepted. Identifying perpetrators and bringing them to account through independent investigations are of utmost importance. Since the early days of the war, we have been seeking an humanitarian ceasefire and a way to open humanitarian corridors. We believe it is necessary to keep dialogue channels open for a peaceful solution and the easing of the humanitarian situation. We should do all we can to keep the diplomatic track going. Turkey will continue to work towards achieving peace without delay. I thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Croacia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Croatia aligns with the EU statement. Croatia continues its strong condemnation of the military aggression by Russia against Ukraine, which dramatically deteriorated human rights situation in the country. We are aware of Moscow's desperate attempts at justifying the unprovoked and unjustifiable invasion. However, nowadays it's much harder to hide war atrocities. We are appalled by numerous mass grave discoveries in liberated areas that were previously under control of Russian armed forces, including in Bucha. Allegations of hundreds of summary executions of civilians in towns in regions of Kyiv, Chernihiv, Kharkiv and Sami, as well as reports of torture, forced displacement and the use of rape as a weapon of war is extremely disturbing. We welcome the prompt commencement of the important work by the Independent International Commission of Inquiry and reiterate the High Commissioner's call for respect for international humanitarian law amid growing evidence of war crimes in Ukraine. We strongly support the request for the High Commissioner to prepare an update on the situation in Mariupol. Mr. President, Croatia stands with Ukraine and calls on other states to join the voices condemning Russian act of aggression that breaches the principle of sovereign equality and the right to self-determination as agreed to in the UN Charter. We welcome all efforts in ensuring humanitarian corridors and we urge Russia to respect the international humanitarian law, to protect civilians and to respect sovereignty, territorial integrity and independence of Ukraine. I thank you.
Muchas gracias. Islandia, por favor.
Thank you, Mr. President. IHL and the Geneva Conventions are clear on the do's and don'ts in international armed conflicts. Human rights law is also clear. We thus should not be having to reconvene today. But Russia's unimaginable violations and disregard for international law and the rules of war have made this essential. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has caused widespread destruction and unspeakable suffering of civilians in Ukraine, including of women and girls. We're witnessing torture and other ill treatment, arbitrary detention, enforced disappearances, and sexual and gender-based violence. In Bucha, Mariupol, and elsewhere, we've seen images of civilians executed and buried in mass graves. Civilians must never be a target, and every precaution must be taken to ensure their safety. There should be no impunity. The Commission of Inquiry will play a central role in collecting evidence and ensuring accountability for the crimes committed. We fully support the investigation launched by the ICC and the work of the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine and other accountability mechanisms. These are necessary to ensure justice for victims, but also to prevent future violations. I thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Eslovenia.
Mr. President, Slovenia expresses its full support for the work of the High Commissioner, the monitoring mission in Ukraine, and the Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine. Slovenia is appalled by the past events in Ukraine caused by Russian unprovoked and unjustified attack that constitutes the most severe violation of the UN Charter. We urge Russia to immediately cease its military aggression. We also reiterate our call on Belarus to abide by its international obligations and stop supporting the Russian aggression. We express grave concern over numerous reports on growing number of civilian casualties, especially women, children, and older persons. My country is appalled by attacks on schools and hospitals, indiscriminate killings, torture, and the use of sexual violence as the weapons of war. These are war crimes. These are crimes against humanity. It is the duty of the international community to ensure full compliance with international human rights and humanitarian law and hold the perpetrators accountable for their violations. This is why comprehensive, independent, and unfettered examination of the events in the areas of Kyiv, Chernihiv, Kharkiv, and Sumy regions during their temporary occupation by the Russian Federation is urgently needed. Our thoughts are with Ukraine and its people. Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Chipre.
Thank you, Mr. President. Cyprus aligns itself with the statement of the European Union. Cyprus remains deeply concerned by the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Ukraine caused by Russia's illegal invasion.
We will keep echoing our solidarity to Ukraine and support for its independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity. We call on the Russian Federation to immediately cease its military operations and withdraw its troops. We are abhorred by violations of international humanitarian and international human rights law as documented by the High Commissioner herself, such as civilian killings, including of women and children, enforced disappearances, torture, and sexual and gender-based violence. We are also alarmed by the destruction of civilian infrastructure, as well as by severe damage to cultural sites in Ukraine and looting of cultural property. Crimes must not be left unpunished. Accountability is an essential element of a rules-based international order. In this vein, we support the work of the Commission of Inquiry as well as the International Criminal Court in their work to investigate crimes so as to deliver justice for Ukraine. I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Vietnam.
Mr. President, Vietnam reaffirms its principled support for the settlement of international disputes by peaceful means in accordance with fundamental principles of international law and the Charter of the United Nations. Parties to the dispute should persevere in finding a long-term peaceful solution on the basis of these principles while taking into due account legitimate interests and concerns of all sides. We once again raise our objection to concerns over all forms of attack against civilian population in violation of international humanitarian and human rights law, especially attacks that result in large civilian casualties or damage to critical civilian infrastructure. Vietnam welcomes the humanitarian assistance that the United Nations and the international community have extended to the people of Ukraine. In a neutral, fair, and transparent manner, we are willing to take part in these efforts. In this regard, the government of Vietnam would provide about $500,000 in humanitarian aid to Ukraine, and this fund would be channeled through international organizations. Finally, we echo the growing call for prompt, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access to an evacuation of people affected by the conflict in Ukraine, including foreign nationals. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra España.
Gracias, señor presidente. España se alinea con la declaración de la Unión Europea. Reiteramos la más firme condena de la agresión rusa contra Ucrania y de las gravísimas vulneraciones de los derechos humanos y el derecho internacional humanitario. Las informaciones que venimos recibiendo de las agencias humanitarias y de la misión de observación de la Oficina de la Alta Comisionada desde el comienzo de la invasión son alarmantes. Mujeres y niños están sufriendo la peor parte de la guerra. España está muy preocupada por el peligro real de que sean víctimas de trata y explotación, tal y como se viene alertando por parte de varias agencias de Naciones Unidas. Los ataques contra escuelas y hospitales son una flagrante violación del derecho internacional humanitario y exigimos su cese inmediato. No habrá paz posible en Ucrania sin justicia para las víctimas. España respalda todos los esfuerzos para asegurar que los responsables de estas atrocidades rindan cuentas ante la justicia. Con más de 40 países hemos apoyado la investigación de la Corte Penal Internacional. Asimismo, respaldamos la labor que están realizando tanto la misión de observación de la Oficina de la Alta Comisionada de Naciones Unidas para los Derechos Humanos como la comisión de investigación establecida por este Consejo. Todos estos esfuerzos deben coordinarse y complementarse para que las investigaciones sean eficaces, colocando a la víctima en el centro para que las atrocidades no queden impunes. Esta guerra de agresión nos recuerda la obligación de seguir defendiendo los principios del derecho internacional humanitario, los derechos humanos y los valores sobre los que se sustenta el orden internacional. Por ello, exigimos a la Federación Rusa que cese de forma total e inmediata su agresión y que cumpla con sus violaciones de derecho internacional. Muchas gracias.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Grecia.
Gracias, Presidente. Greece fully allies itself with the EU statement. We are now 3 months into the unprovoked and unjustified invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And today we have heard of shocking atrocities committed, rising civilian casualties, unabated human suffering, and wide-scale destruction of vital infrastructure. Greece unequivocally condemns and rejects Russia's ongoing aggression and military occupation of Ukrainian territory. We condemned all actions that may amount to war crimes taking place in besieged cities in Ukraine, and in particular in Mariupol, home to a centuries-old Greek community, 120,000 strong, that suffers immensely as we speak. Greece is appalled by the serious violations of human rights and international humanitarian law in Ukraine. In that vein, we welcome the investigation launched by the International Criminal Court prosecutor. We also support the Commission of Inquiry and its work. We stress the need for cooperation among states, civil society, and international mechanisms in order to ensure that perpetrators of all violations will be held to account. Excellencies, we call on Russia to respect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity and abide by the principles of international humanitarian and human rights law. All crimes should not go unpunished. We stand in solidarity with the people of Ukraine. Thank you.
Gracias. Y último orador de esta mañana, tiene palabra a delegação do Timor-Leste.
Muito obrigada, Sr. Presidente. Timor-Leste welcomes the organization of this special session on the deteriorating human rights situation in Ukraine stemming from Russian aggression. 78 days have passed since Russia invaded Ukraine, and it is the second time this year that the Council is addressing the deteriorating human rights situation in Ukraine. As a country that knows firsthand that war brings benefit to no one, Timor-Leste is saddened that peace and ceasefire have not been achieved in Ukraine. Timor-Leste condemns the violations and abuses of human rights and serious breaches of international humanitarian law happening in Ukraine. In this respect, we call on all parties to the conflict to immediately cease military hostilities, refrain from using violence against civilians, and targeting civilian objects. Timor-Leste reiterates its urgent call for the respect of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Timor-Leste reaffirms its strong commitment to the sovereignty, political independence, territorial integrity, and unity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders, and reiterates its call on Russia to immediately and unconditionally withdraw all its military forces from the territory of Ukraine. Timor-Leste welcomes the establishment and appointment of the members of the Commission of Inquiry and supports the work of the Commission in undertaking a comprehensive and independent special inquiry aiming to hold to account those responsible. Mr. President, I wish to conclude this statement by reiterating Timor-Leste's appeal for peace, dialogue, and an immediate ceasefire. I thank you.
Muito obrigado. Hemos llegado al final de la reunión de esta mañana. Nos reuniremos aquí de nuevo a las 15:03 de la tarde para continuar nuestro debate, tomar acción sobre el proyecto de resolución. Declaro clausurada la primera sesión del 34º periodo extraordinario de sesiones del Consejo de Derechos Humanos.